What's going on, everyone? It's Ben from YGO from Zero, back with another retro Yu-Gi-Oh video, and we have finally made it. If you've been following my channel from the beginning, then you saw that we started out at Legend of Blue Eyes. We've been going through every format in Yu-Gi-Oh's history up until this point, and we've finally made it to Chaos format, which is the format that is generally viewed as the point that the game changed forever. Now, the DM era formats that came before this were very fun in their own ways. They were often a lot more grindy and back and forth. And to be fair, this format does have a little bit of grind to it as well. And it is back and forth in a lot of cases. But the boss monsters that were introduced in the latest pack, Invasion of Chaos, that was introduced to the card pool, just really do warp the entire game around them and make for some very, very quick games. Now, not always quick. There are these two boss monsters and they are limited. So, you're not going to draw them all the time. But when they do hit the field, they often do just end the game. And, that is a bit of a change of pace from what came before this format. But it is still very exciting. And a lot of people have a lot of nostalgia for this period of the game. And I can see why. The games are very, very fun, even if, these Saki cards do exist in them. And I'm excited to share with you what this format is about. Now, if you're new to the channel, basically I go through and I make guides on all these formats. And, I generally there's assumed that you have a level of familiarity with what came before it. But I generally do a good job of going through all the important cards that you need to know if you're going to play this format. If you do want, more expansive discussions of the cards that were already in the card pool, then you can check out my other guides. But in this video, I'm going to be going over the new cards that were added in Invasion of Chaos, which is the new set that Chaos format introduces. And also, I'll be going over the new limited list that was instituted for Chaos format. And this is actually the last list that's called a limited list, because after this, cards will be getting banned. And that is because there are just very, very powerful cards in this format that, Konami and Upper Deck Entertainment, they were like, yeah, we can't, we can't let this go on because these are just the best cards by a mile. And, people aren't necessarily going to play the new cards that we release. So before I dive in to the new cards themselves, let's just talk about the limited list here. Most of the cards on the limited list are cards that see play in pretty much every deck. So it is good to familiarize with most of the limited list if you do want to play this format. And to start off with, we've got the boss monsters themselves, Chaos Emperor Dragon, Envoy of the End, and Black Luster Soldier, Envoy of the Beginning. Now, these are two very powerful boss monsters. I'm going to be covering them in more detail in the next section of the video, so I'm not going to go super in-depth here. But these cards do warp the format around them. They are very powerful, 3,000 attack point monsters. They can be brought out by just banishing a light and dark monster in your graveyard, and that is a very easy summoning condition to fulfill. So a lot of decks do start adopting new light monsters into their deck, and there are just very powerful dark monsters already, so it slots in very well in those. Now, Invasion of Chaos also introduced one new monster that was also added to this list, but we'll get to that a bit later as it's not really that relevant for most decks. For now, let's go through all the cards that were previously already on the limited list. Firstly, we've got Cyberjar. Cyberjar is a very powerful flip effect monster, destroys all monsters on the field when it's flipped face up, and then both players reveal the top 5 cards of their deck. If there are any level 4 or lower monsters in that, they either set them down or they summon them in attack position, then they add the remaining cards to their hand. This was limited because certain decks like Empty Jar, which are combo decks that basically use these jar monsters to just burn through their opponent's decks, those decks are very good if you add more than one Cyber Jar. We've also got Fiber Jar. Fiber Jar is very interesting. Flip effect monster says flip. Each player shuffles all cards from their hand, field, and graveyard into the deck, then draws 5 cards. And this is a very versatile card, but it can cause games to drag on for quite some time, which is why it is limited. But I do think that this card is a little bit overhated, and in the context of these formats, it is pretty fun a lot of the time. Of course, there are just games where it's just Fiber Jar, and the game lasts forever, but most of the time this card is, I think, pretty healthy. But at more than one copy, it would definitely be a little bit more degenerate. Next up, we've got the 5 pieces of Exodia, Exodia the Forbidden One, a left arm, left leg, right arm, and right leg. Now, these are 5 pieces that are mainly limited for lore reasons because, if you have all 5 of these pieces in your hand, you do win the game. So it makes sense that each of these would only be 1 copy each, a very special card that you have to search out in your deck. But Exodia isn't really the best win con. So, you probably won't see this too often, but it is good to know that it is in the format. Next up, we've got Sangan and Witch of the Black Forest. These two monsters are very similar. Sangan lets you search a monster from your deck with 1500 or less attack when it's destroyed or sent to the graveyard. Or it doesn't have to be destroyed, but as long as it's sent from the field with the graveyard. And Witch lets you do something very similar where you add a monster with 1500 or less defense from your deck to your hand. Now, the last part of these cards that say, like, but you cannot activate cards or effective cards with that name for the rest of the turn, that doesn't apply in this format. That was a later errata to these card effects. So it is good to know about. And I'll also be talking about the errata that Chaos Emperor Dragon received when I talk about the card in more detail. But it is good to know that some of these cards do have erratas, and I'm going to point out where they do. And beyond the cards on the limited list, most cards don't have erratas, so you won't really need to worry about them. But it is good to know that some of these cards do work a little bit differently from how their modern text implies. Next up, we've got Jinzo, a very powerful tribute monster. Level 6 monster, 2400 attack, 1500 defense, which means it can be searched off of Witch of Black Forest. It says trap cards and their effect on the field cannot be activated. Negate all trap effects on the field. And this could be very good at just shutting down your opponent's traps to enable you to go for like an OTK push. So that's why this card is limited to 1. Next up, we got Sinister Serpent. It's a level 1 monster, 300 attack, 250 defense. It says during your standby phase, if this card is in your graveyard, you can return it to your hand. Now, the later part of the effect, that says also banish 1 Sinister Serpent from your graveyard. That does not apply at this point in the time. That was a later errata. This card works as it originally did, where, you can just add it back to hand if it's in your graveyard. It's not once per turn, so if you then use something like Raigeki Break in your standby phase, pitching this card, you can then add it back again. So, very, very good card here. Next up, we got Yatagarasu, which is, a lot of people point to this card as the reason why cards started getting banned, and this format is the first format where you can really fully take advantage of the degeneracy of this card in conjunction with Chaos Emperor Dragon. But for now, let's just talk about the effect. It says cannot be special summoned during the end phase of the turn. This card was normal summoned or flip face up. Return to the hand. If this card inflicts battle damage to your opponent, skip the draw phase of their next turn. So basically, you can effectively Yata lock your opponent. If your opponent doesn't really have many cards in hand, and you summon a Yata attack in, deal 200, they can't draw. You just keep summoning out Yata every turn, preventing them from drawing, and you win the game that way. And there is a way to sort of turbo out this combo that I'll get to later, which makes it a little bit degenerate. Although further testing has shown that that combo isn't necessarily the most consistent thing in the world, so you might not see it as much as you'd expect to. Next up, we've got Exiled Force. Exiled Force is a level 4 warrior type monster with 1000 attack, 1000 defense. So you can tribute this card, then target one monster in the field, destroy that target. Now, priority does exist in this format. I mean, priority technically exists in every format, but ignition effect priority exists in this format. So basically, when you summon out Exiled Force, you can just immediately use its effect, dodge around things like Trap Hole, and like immediately pop an opponent's monster, which is very, very powerful. And also, this card is very searchable off things like Sangan and Witch of the Black Forest, and Reinforcement in the Army, which we'll get to soon. Next up, we've got Injection Fairy Lily, level 3 monster, 400 attack, 1500 defense. It says if this card attacks or is attacked during damage calculation, either player's turn, you can pay 2000 life points once per battle. This card gains 3000 attack during that damage calculation only. So, Injection Fairy Lily at a slight cost to you can be 3400 damage against your opponent, which can be very good at just finishing off the game if they're low on life. So this card is very good. And oftentimes, you can sort of pair this with things like Chaos Emperor Dragon to get in for a lot of damage. Next up, we've got Twin-Headed Behemoth. This card isn't really individually powerful. It's mainly here because of, it's just weird effect. It says during the end phase, if this card is in the graveyard because it was destroyed on the field and sent there this turn, you can special summon this card, but its attack and defense become 1000. You can only use the effect of Twin-Headed Behemoth once per duel. Now, originally, this card just said you can only use this effect once per duel, basically. And so there's a bit of confusion if you had multiple copies of Twin-Headed Behemoth in your deck and they got shuffled back into the deck with something like Fiber Jar potentially. Then, if you draw one later, was that the one that used its effect or was it the one that didn't? It was a bit tough to know, so this card got limited just to prevent rulings, nightmares like that. Of course, now the way the effect's worded, there's no problem, but back in the day it was a potential issue. Next up, we've got Breaker the Magical Warrior here. This is a 1600 attack point monster with 1000 defense. If this card is normal summon, place one spell counter on it. Gains 300 attack for your spell counter on it. You can remove one spell counter from this card, then target one spell or trap card on the field, destroy that target. This is very good at just clearing away your opponent's back row, and also just having a 1900 beater sometimes is very, very good. So a very versatile card. very good card and sees play in most decks. Next up, we've got Tribe Infecting Virus. This is a very, very powerful monster. 1600 attack, 1000 defense. So discard one card from your hand and declare one type of monster. Destroy all face-up monsters of the declared type on the field. It can be great clearing away your opponent's established board and getting in for damage. And if you pair it with something like Sinister Serpent, then the discard isn't really that big of a deal. Next up, we've got Magical Scientist, level 1 monster, 300 attack, 300 defense. Pay 1000 life points to special summon one level 6 or lower fusion monster from your extra deck in face-up attack or defense position. That fusion monster cannot attack your opponent's life points directly and return to your extra deck at the end of the turn. Now, the main reason why this was limited is because there is a Scientist FDK deck that you can play, where basically you get a bunch of fusion monsters, tribute them all off with Capital Turtle, which is also not once per turn, and you deal 8,000 damage exactly to your opponent. Now, with it limited to 1, that deck isn't as prevalent. It's not quite as good. But Magical Scientist itself is still a very versatile card. You can bring it out, use its effect to bring out things like Thousand Eyed Restrict, suck up your opponent's monsters, bring out things like Dark Balter, the Terrible, and, deal with things like Sangan, which is Black Forest. Very, very powerful card, very, very versatile card, and definitely deserved at 1 copy here. Next up, we've got Vampire Lord. Vampire Lord is a level 5 monster with 2000 attack, 1500 defense that says if this card inflicts battle damage to your opponent, declare one card type, monster, spell, or trap. Your opponent sends one card of that type from their deck to the graveyard. And that's not the reason why this card is on this list. Once per turn during your next standby phase, after this card in your possession was destroyed and sent to your graveyard by an opponent's card effect, so summon this card from the graveyard. So the reason it's on this list is because it can be very annoying to deal with for your opponent. Now, there are things like DD Warrior that can deal with that pretty easily. So this card is really one of the more underpowered cards on the limited list, and a lot of just general decks don't play it. But it is good to know about, and there are devoted zombie decks that can bring this out. Next up, we've got Reflect Bounder. Reflect Bounder is a level 4 light monster with 1700 attack, 1000 defense that says before damage calculation, if this card is being attacked by an opponent's monster and was in an attack position at the start of the damage step, inflict damage to your opponent equal to the attacking monster's attack. If you do, after damage calculation, destroy this card. So this is on this list because it can be kind of annoying for burn decks to have this. But again, just like with Vampire Lord, it's not really the most impressive card. Most decks won't play this, although given the fact that it is a light and 1700 attack is decent and does deal some damage, maybe we'll see play as just a good light target to have in a Chaos deck. But that's going to do it for the limited monsters. Let's get into the limited spells, which really start to amp up the power level, and that's saying something given how powerful some of these monsters are. First up, we've got the iconic Power 5 spells. We've got Change of Heart, which lets you take control of one monster your opponent controls until the end phase. We got Dark Hole, which destroys all monsters on the field. Monster Reborn, which brings back a monster from the graveyard. Pot of Greed, which lets you draw 2 cards. And Raigeki, which destroys all monsters your opponents control. These 5 cards have just very, very simple but very, very powerful effects, and that's why they are all limited here. And pretty much every deck plays all 5 of these cards. Next up, we've got the Hand Rips. Confiscation, which lets you pay 1000 life points. Look at your opponent's hand, select one card in it, discard that card. Delinquent Duo, which lets you pay 1000 life points. Your opponent discards one random card, and if they have any other card in their hand, they discard one more of their choice. And then Forceful Sentry, which says look at your opponent's hand, select one card among them, and return to his or her deck. The deck is then shuffled. And these 3 cards, if you draw them turn 1, they can be very, very devastating. You can get full hand knowledge of your opponent, get rid of their most powerful card, in the case of Forceful Sentry and Confiscation, or just, get a +1 with Delinquent Duo, discarding 2 of their cards, starting them off on the back foot. So these cards are very, very good, although in the late game, they can be a lot worse than early on. Next up, we've got Painful Choice. Very, very powerful card, especially in this format. Spell card that says select 5 cards from your deck and show them to your opponent. Your opponent selects one card among them, add that card to your hand, discard the remaining cards to the graveyard. So this is extremely powerful in Chaos format, as you can send lights and darks to your graveyard to just set up for Black Luster Soldier or Chaos Ember Dragon immediately. But even in previous formats, it's just very, very good. It can just get you a card that you need to finish the game to your hand, or just get bricks out of your deck, like things like the Hand Rips. For instance, you can send 3 Hand Rips, send a light and a dark monster, and that's a really, really tricky choice for your opponent. So I do think Painful Choice is one of the most broken cards in this format. Next up, we got Snatch Steal, which is basically Exchange of Heart, but an equip spell. It says equip only to a monster your opponent controls. Take control of the equipped monster during each of your opponent's standby phases. They gain 1,000 life points. So very, very good. It can come back to bite you if your opponent can stall you off a bit and they just keep getting life points from this. Also, it is susceptible to things like Mystical Space Typhoon, but it is still a very, very good card that sees play in a lot of decks. Next up, we got Harpy's Feather Duster and Heavy Storm. Both of these are spell and trap removal cards. Harpy's Feather Duster says destroy all spell and traps your opponent controls. Heavy Storm says destroy all spell and traps on the field. So in this format, Harpy's Feather Duster is definitely the more powerful card, but these cards are both very good if you are worried about a ton of your opponent's back row. Next up, we've got Graceful Charity, another draw spell. It says draw 3 cards, then discard 2 cards. This is one of the most powerful cards in the game, especially in Chaos format, as you can draw 3 cards, discard a Light and a Dark, and then go for your Chaos play. So very, very good cards. He's played in pretty much every deck. Next up, we got Upstart Goblin. This is a normal spell that says draw 1 card, then your opponent gains 1,000 life points. This is here because certain combo decks that don't really care about their opponent's life points can be very, very good if you have 3 copies of this. But this card might see play just in general. Upstart Goblin is a card that's been viewed differently at different points in the game's history, and in later formats, people realized how creative this was, and they started playing 3 copies of it. Maybe in Chaos format, given how powerful the Chaos monsters are, playing the Upstart Goblin will become a mandatory thing because it just is so good to turbo into them. But at this point, it is very unclear exactly where Upstart Goblin lies in this metagame. So, very interesting card. Definitely something to experiment with in the future. Next up, we got Premature Burial, an equip spell that says activate this card by paying 800 life points, then target 1 monster in your graveyard, special summon that target in attack position, and equip it with this card. When this card is destroyed, destroy the equipped monster. So this is a very, very powerful equip. It's basically like Monster Reborn, and it can bring back a monster from your graveyard. Now, this card hasn't seen as much play in previous formats because it is shut off by things like Imperial Order, like Mystical Space Typhoon, and so it's not quite as good as Reborn, but it is still a very good card to know about and a card to potentially play. Next up, we've got Mage Power and United We Stand, which are 2 equip cards that are mainly here because they can enable certain OTKs. Mage Power says the equipped monster gains 500 attack and defense for each spell trap you control, and United We Stand says the equipped monster gains 800 attack and defense for each face-up monster you control. So if you use these to buff up a monster and then attack in for a ton of damage, that can be very, very good. Next up, we got Card Destruction, which is mainly here for the empty jar decks that I mentioned earlier. Both players discard as many cards as possible from their hands, then each player draws the same number of cards that they discarded. This is mainly here for the empty jar decks, but I can see this seeing play in this format as, you use it to set up lights and darks and grave, draw into like your Blacklist Soldier or your Chaos Emperor Dragon. So I think this card definitely could see play in this format. Next up, we got Swords of Forbidden Light. This is a stall card that says after this card's activation, it remains on field, but you must destroy it during the end phase of your opponent's 3rd turn. When this card is activated, if your opponent controls a face-down monster, flip all monsters they control face up. While this card is face up on the field, your opponent's monsters cannot declare an attack. This is basically a stall card. I don't really think it necessarily deserves to be on this list right now. Given that you have access to things like Mystical Space Typhoon, like Heavy Storm, like Harpy's Feather Duster, but it is here just to curtail stall decks, so I don't think it's necessarily a bad thing that it's here. Next up, we got Mirage of Nightmare, a very powerful draw spell. Continuous spell that says once per turn during your opponent's standby phase, draw cards until you have 4 cards in your hand. If you do during your next standby phase, after that, randomly discard the same number of cards you drew, or your entire hand if you do not have enough cards. This is a very, very powerful card. Lets you turbo through your deck. If you're playing Mystical Space Typhoon, you can then use Mystical Space Typhoon, get rid of this card to still gain the advantages. And you can even max out on things that do this. You can also add emergency provisions as well if you really want to. But generally the triple Mystical Space Typhoon is good enough. And that can just be very powerful at shutting this thing off, drawing a bunch of cards, and just, getting a ton of card advantage. Next up, we got Butterfly Dagger Elma. This is an equipped spell that says the equipped monster gains 300 attack. When this card is destroyed and sent to the graveyard while equipped, you can return this card to the hand. This is mainly here for certain FTK strategies using Gearfried, Gearfried, the Iron Knight, and Royal Magical Library. As basically, you equip this to Gearfried, Gearfried destroys it with its effect. You get this back to hand. Royal Magical Library gets a counter, and you can just keep doing this. Royal Magical Library can effectively get infinite counters, get infinite draws, and that should be able to draw you into whatever win con you're playing. So it's limited here for good reason, and it doesn't really see play in most decks, but for the library FTK decks, it probably is best that it is limited. Next up, we've got Imperial Order. Very, very powerful continuous trap. One of the most toxic cards in the DM era, I'd say. It's a continuous trap that has been eroded, so it says negate all spell effects on the field. once per turn during the standby phase, and back in Chaos format, this was during your standby phase, you can pay 700 life points or this card is destroyed. So basically, you get to choose whether to pay for this or not. And also, it doesn't trigger during your opponent's standby phase. You basically have to decide during your standby phase, and you only pay during your standby phase. So very, very good at shutting off pretty much all the spells in the game. Mystical Spade Typhoon can play around this. If you go for a powerful spell, your opponent activates Imperial Order, and then you fire a Mystical Spade Typhoon on the Imperial Order, then you can clear it that way. But it still is a very powerful card that can just shut down the game very easily. Next up, we got Call of the Haunted. This is a continuous trap. This says activate this card by targeting one monster in your graveyard. Supposed to summon that target in attack position. When this card leaves the field, destroy that monster. When that monster is destroyed, destroy this card. So you need to just bring back a powerful monster and get in for more damage, or, set up a tribute, or do whatever you want to with that. So it's basically like a Monster Reborn or Premature Burial, but you can use it during your opponent's turn, which is very nice. Next up, we got a Ceasefire. This is mainly here to curtail burn strategies. This is if a face-down defense position monster or an effect monster is on the field, change all face-down defense position monsters on the field to face-up defense position. Effect monsters are not activated this time. Also, inflict 500 damage to your opponent for each effect monster on the field. Now, burn decks use this, but outside of those, it's not really as seen. It is seen in side decks, however. Against certain flip-focused strategies, this can be very, very good to bring in. Next up, we got Mirror Force. Mirror Force says, when your opponent's monster declares an attack, destroy all your opponent's attack position monsters. So this can be very good at stopping your opponent from getting super aggressive. And this is, in my opinion, a very balanced trap in this format. And a very good trap to know about because you do have to constantly be playing around this card. Next up, we get Magic Cylinder, which is, again, not really seen outside of burn decks, but said when an opponent's monster declares an attack, target the attacking monster, negate the attack, and if you do, inflict damage to your opponent equal to its attack. So this can be very good at, sort of turning around a big attack and dealing it to your opponent. Next up, we got Reckless Greed. This says draw 2 cards and skip your next 2 draw phases. So again, like Upstart Goblin, is mainly here for certain combo decks that will want to take advantage of this. But unlike Upstart Goblin, I think this card is much more iffy in a general deck, as you kind of do just want to keep drawing. But I could definitely see people experimenting with this as another way to turbo into your Chaos monsters. Next up, we've got Ring of Destruction here. This is another card that has received an errata. So basically, the text that you see on the screen here is really different from how the effect actually works. The effect just reads, target one face-up monster on the field, destroy that target, and inflict damage to your opponent and you equal to the attack that it had on the field. So this card can indeed cause draws. It can indeed be activated at any point as long as your opponent has a face-up monster, or you have a face-up monster. You can use this on your own monsters as well. So, it does have versatility there. You can go in for an attack with your own monster, then use this ring on your own monster to destroy it and deal the last bit of damage to your opponent that you need. So this card is extremely, extremely good. Definitely, if you are playing it, look up the errata effect for it. It's the same way it works in GOAT, though, if you're familiar with that. And that's going to do it for the limited cards. Moving on to the semi-limited cards. The semi-limited list is much smaller, which makes sense as semi-limited cards are kind of in a weird spot where they're being acknowledged that it's good, but not too good. So it's kind of weird. But first up, we've got Morphing Jar and Morphing Jar number 2. These are here, again, for the empty jar strategy. Morphing Jar says flip both players discard as many cards as possible from their hand, then each player draws 5 cards, which can potentially see play in a general good stuff deck as well. It lets you turbo through your deck again for things like your Chaos monsters. And Morphing Jar number 2 is a bit more specific, so it probably won't see as much play. It says flip, shuffle all monsters on the field into the deck, then each player excavates cards from the top of their deck until they excavate the same number of monsters they shuffled into their main deck. Special summon all excavated level 4 or lower monsters in face down defense position. Also send the remaining cards to the graveyard. So very, very good for Empty Jar. Not really that useful outside of Empty Jar. Next up, we got Marauding Captain. This is a level 3 warrior monster that says monsters your opponent controls cannot target warrior monsters for attacks except this one. When this card is normal summon, you can special summon one level 4 or lower monster from your hand. Doesn't really see play in many decks. The reason it's at 2 is because, with 2 copies of Marauding Captain, you can set up something called the Captain Lock, which is basically if you have 2 of them on your field face up, your opponent can't attack either because each one tries to redirect the attack to themselves. So at 3 copies, this Captain Lock could potentially be more consistent, so they decided to semi-limit it right away. I don't really think the Captain Lock is that big a deal to worry about. This card probably could be at 3. But I mean, if you do want to go for that, it is here to go for, I guess. And next up is a new monster on the semi-limited list from Invasion of Chaos, and that is Manticore of Darkness. Now, you might be wondering how powerful this card is, considering it's on the list along with things like, Black Luster Shoulder Envoy at the beginning and Chaos Ember Dragon Envoy at the end. And the answer is not really that powerful in general, but there is a specific combo you can do with this card that is really degenerate. Basically, the idea is if you have some way to send this to your graveyard, over the course of your turn, and you have another copy of this in hand, in addition to card of safe return on your field. Basically, what you get to do in the end phase is send the Manticore of Darkness in your hand to the graveyard, special summon the one from the graveyard to your field, draw a card off card of safe return. Then the Manticore of Darkness, now in your graveyard, will trigger its effect, send the Manticore of Darkness on field to the graveyard. You bring back the Manticore of Darkness from your graveyard to the field. You special summon another monster from your graveyard, you draw off card of safe return, and then you just repeat that loop over and over again, drawing through your entire deck. So if you're playing something like an Exodia deck, this can allow you to draw into all 5 pieces. And so they decided to semi-limit this card. Still, this combo does exist in the format, even if it is a bit harder to pull off. And there are things like Witch of the Black Forest, which can search out this monster. So it is good to know about. This card also is pretty decent in certain beast decks as well, which are decks that, are potentially playable in this format, which I'll get into later in the guide. Next up for these semi-limited spells, we've got Nobleman of Crossout here. It says target one face-down monster on the field, destroy that target, and if you do, banish it. Then if it was a flip effect monster, each player reveals their main deck, then banishes all cards from it with that monster's name. So this is very, very good against flip-focused strategies, and is often sided in or just played in the main deck, as flip monsters are pretty good this format, or just like setting like a Witch or a Sangan or a Sinister Serpent is very good as well, and Nobleman of Crossout is very powerful against those monsters. Also, it's depriving your opponent of a potential light or dark in their graveyard too. The Nobleman of Crossout, very, very good card in this format, and potentially should see play in the main deck. Next up, we got Creature Swap. Creature Swap is a normal spell that says each player chooses one monster they control and switches control of those monsters with each other. Those monsters cannot change their battle positions for the rest of this turn. This can be good in recruiter-based strategies. Basically, you summon out something like a Mystic Tomato, fire Creature Swap, take control of your opponent's monster, attack into the Mystic Tomato, bring out another monster from deck, attack into your opponent's life points directly. So Creature Swap is a good card to know about for those sorts of decks. I'm not quite sure it deserves to be semi-limited, but it can be pretty decent. And there are some other applications for it, like if you are playing Scapegoats, you can fire Scapegoat on your opponent's turn, switch the Scapegoat to attack, creature swap it with your opponent's monster, and then attack into it. So there are things like that you can do as well. But overall, I don't really think this is the best card out there. Next up, we got Reinforcing the Army. This is a normal spell. This is add one level 4 lower warrior monster from your deck to your hand. And I think this is a very, very good search spell. This is played in just, warrior tribal decks that are just playing, a bunch of warriors, but it's also played in regular decks as well. Decks that play like a DD Warrior Lady package or an Exiled Force as well can use Reinforcing the Army, search out those cards, banish an opponent's monster, tribute off and destroy an opponent's monster, things like that. So I do think that Reinforcing the Army is a good card in this format. You can also, potentially search a light or dark if you need it. If you play like a Dark Warrior as well, like Don Zalug or Zambara the Dark, then that can be good to search with this card too. And lastly, for the semi-limited list, we've got Last Turn. Last Turn is a pretty degenerate trap card that says this card can only be activated during your opponent's turn when your life points are 1,000 or less. Select one monster on your side of the field and send all other cards on the field in their respective owner's hands to their respective graveyards. After that, your opponent selects and special summons one monster from their deck in face-up attack position and attacks your selected monster. Any battle damage from this battle is treated as 0. The player whose monster remains alone on field at the end phase of this turn wins the duel. Any other case results in a draw. So the idea behind this is if you summon out a monster like Jagan the Spiritualist, which prevents your opponent from special summoning, then they can't special summon a monster to their side of the field to then participate in that battle, and then you can just win because you'll have a monster on your side of the field, your opponent won't, and that'll count as a win for you due to this card's effect. Very, very tricky card to pull off. You can pull it off with things like Inspection to get your life points low, and the Jagan, as I mentioned. But it is a bit tricky to do, and it's very easy to side against this strategy. So I don't really think that this deck is the best, but this card's semi-limited just in case. And that's going to do it for the limited list here and the semi-limited list as well. This is a pretty good primer on cards that you should probably either be playing in your deck or be aware of in the format. So definitely like when you're building your decks for yourself, definitely, consider this and consider a lot of these cards as they are extremely good. But with that out of the way, let's dive in to the new cards that Chaos format introduced. Okay, before we dive in to the new sort of cards from Invasion of Chaos, there were some promo cards that was released between Vampire format and Chaos format that, I mean, I don't think they'll see much play, but they are good to talk about at least in this format. So let's just discuss them really quickly. Firstly, we've got the monster Dark Sage. Cannot be normal summoned or set. Must first be spell summoned from your hand or deck by attributing one dark condition immediately after applying the effect of Time Wizard, in which you call the coin toss right. When spell summoned this way, add one spell card from your deck to your hand. So very powerful effect if you can actually bring it out. The issue is that the effect is really hard to actually pull off because you need to have Dark Condition on your side of the field. It's a level 7 monster. It's really difficult to bring out. And also, you need to have Time Wizard. You have to get the 50-50 coin toss correct. And that is very, very risky to actually bring out this card. So I don't really think this is the best, but it is sort of a janky card. And if you do bring it out, you're probably winning the game because, its effect is really powerful. It's also got 2800 attack, 3200 defense, so it is really good in that way. But yeah, I don't think this card will see much play. Next up, we've got a card that is kind of weird because, like, I've seen conflicting sources on, like, whether this is in the format or not in this format. I know that the way this format is counted on Format Library with the bot there, I checked, and this card is said to be legal by that bot, so I'm going to say that it's tentatively legal, but it might not be legal. The good thing is that this card will probably not see any play, so I don't think you need to worry about whether this card's in the format or not, and that is Mesmeric Control. Mesmeric Control says during your opponent's next turn, after you activate this card, your opponent cannot change the battle position of monsters except with the card effect. So, I mean, that doesn't really do much overall, and I mean, I guess it's good against Clown Control. It's anti-Clown Control tech. But yeah, this card is really bad. So it shouldn't matter whether it's in the format or not. But just an interesting like edge case that I wanted to point out. Next up, we got a trap that I think might see some play in this format, and that is Widespread Ruin. This is a normal trap that says, when an opponent's monster declares an attack, destroy the attack position monster your opponent controls with the highest attack, your choice if tied. This is kind of like strictly worse than Sakuretsu Armor, but Sakuretsu Armor is still a very good card in this format, so Widespread Ruin could definitely see play as well. Also, it doesn't target. That's not really that impactful here. There's nothing like King Dragoon, for instance, that prevents things at target, but it is good to know about at least. Next up, we've got Seal the Ancients. This is a normal spell that says pay 1,000 life points, pick up and see all face-down cards on your opponent's side of the field, then return them to their original positions. The effect of the face-down cards are not activated. This gives you some knowledge of what your opponent's working with, I guess, but it's really not worth it to have that. I mean, the hand rips are so much better giving that sort of knowledge, and generally you should just sort of try and play through whatever they got either way. So, yeah, I think this card is just a strict -1 that doesn't really do much. Next up, we've got Aqua Course, the continuous strat that says if there are monsters with the same name on the field, those monsters gain 500 attack and defense. So if you are playing a deck, playing multiple copies of a given monster, this could potentially be good. But in general, it's not really the best, especially because there are so many monsters that are shared between so many decks. This card will buff up your opponent's monsters as well. So I don't really think this card is worth playing, but it is an interesting trap to know about. Next up, we've got some cards from Starter Deck Yugi Evolution, Kaiba Evolution. The first being from Yugi's side of things. We got Blackluster Soldier, the ritual monster, level 8, 3,000 attack, 2,500 defense, can only be summoned, or not only be summoned, because there is actually a card in this set that will be able to summon this out. But it can be summoned with Blackluster Ritual. Blackluster Ritual spell, as just said, can be used to ritual summon Blackluster Soldier. You must also tribute monsters from your hand or field whose total levels equal 8 or more. So, pretty straightforward stuff for a ritual. It is 3,000 attack, which is pretty decent. Also, if you are playing like Blue Eyes White Dragon, you can just tribute that off for your 1 tribute there. But if you're playing ritual monsters, Masked Beast has more attack, so it might be better to play that. But still good to know about at least. Next up, we've got Kaiser Seahorse, which comes from Kaiba's side of things. This says this card can be treated as a 2 tributes for the tribute summon of the light monster. So, of course, the light monster in mind is Blue Eyes White Dragon. You can tribute this out just using Kaiser. But Blue Eyes White Dragon is not really the best card in this format, so I don't really think the Kaiser Seahorse will see much play. But it is a 1,700 light monster, so who knows. Next up, we got Shadow Spell. This is a continuous trap that says activate this card by targeting 1 face-up monster your opponent controls. It loses 700 attack, also cannot attack or change its battle position. When it leaves the field, destroy this card. So that can be a pretty good way to stall out your opponent a little bit. And also the 700 attack reduction can come up as well. But, that being said, I don't really think any of these cards will see much play outside of, like, maybe Widespread Ruin, Black Left's Soldier, maybe for more janky ritual decks. But yeah, Widespread Ruin is the main one to know about from this set. But these were the cards not in Invasion of Chaos. I just wanted to sort of mention them off their own section. But now that I have, let's just dive into the cards from Invasion of Chaos and see how that set changed the game forever. Now, I call this section general good stuff. But, like, I do have some cards on here that may not be considered good enough to play in your average deck. I just call it this because, these cards are the cards from Invasion of Chaos that I could see just seeing general play. Like, you don't need a specific archetype or anything like that to play these. And they are decent enough, and they can have certain cases that can come up that I could see a deck generally playing it. So that's why I arranged it this way. Of course, there are also some incredibly powerful cards that I expect pretty much every deck to play. And to start off with, let's go over one of those. Black Left's Soldier Envoy at the beginning. Now, I mentioned this in the limited list section of the video, but I didn't really mention its effects, and the effects are one of the reasons why this and Chaos Emperor Dragon are so powerful. So, of course, to start off with, it's a light monster, level 8, warrior, 3,000 attack, 2,500 defense, cannot be normal summoned or set, must first be special summoned from your hand by banishing 1 light and 1 dark monster from your graveyard. Once per turn, you can activate one of these effects. Target 1 monster on the field, banish it. This card cannot attack the turn this effect is activated, or if this attacking card destroys an opponent's monster by battle, it can make a second attack in a row. This is an incredibly versatile card. If your opponent is a set monster, you can banish it, prevent someone like Sanguine or Witch from being able to use their effects. You could also just try and get aggressive if your opponent has a monster inside the field and low life points. You try and attack over it, and then attack in for 3,000 more additional damage after that. And this makes this card a very, very threatening card. And a very, very dangerous card that you also, have to constantly be playing around. Its counterpart, Chaos Emperor Dragon Envoy at the end, is a Dark Dragon monster, level 8, 3,000 attack, 2,500 defense, cannot be normal summoned or set, must be summoned from your hand by banishing 1 light and 1 dark monster from your graveyard. And once per turn, you can pay 1,000 life points, send as many cards in both players' hand and on the field as possible to the graveyard, then inflict 300 damage to your opponent for each card sent to the opponent's graveyard by this effect. Now, this last part that says you cannot activate other cards the turn or effects during the turn you activate this card's effect, that is a later errata. That is not present in Chaos format, so you can indeed activate other cards or effects during the turn you activate this card's effect, and you can use it like right away if you want to. Very, very powerful card. Now, this is powerful just as a finisher, like, you get in for a ton of damage, then fire Chaos Emperor Dragon, just close out the game out of nowhere. It's also powerful at setting up certain degenerate combos, and this is what I was alluding to when I talked about Yada. Basically, the idea is that if you already have a, like, Sanguine or a Witch face down on the field, or face up on the field, just on the field in some capacity, and you spell summon out Chaos Emperor Dragon Envoy at the end, use the effect, pop the entire field. You will then get the effect of Sanguine or Witch, searching out a Yata-Garasu. Yata-Garasu can then be summoned out, attack in for 200 damage, and Yata-Lock your opponent, because they'll have no cards in hand, ideally, and that will be able to just shut down the game for them. Now, in practice, this has multiple sort of issues. One issue being that you actually have to set up this combo. You have to have the Sanguine or Witch already on field in order to actually pull it off. You have to have the Yata in deck to actually get it to hand. And also, your opponent has to not have like a Sanguine or Witch Black Force of their own, or a Sinister Serpent, as Sinister Serpent will also potentially wall up the Yata Lock. So there are a lot of issues with this, and in modern sort of reevaluation of this format, people have moved away a little bit from the Yata Lock. A lot of decks do still play the option of it, but in general, you can sort of do a similar thing if you have, like, for instance, Injection Fairy Lily in your deck. After the Chaos Emperor Dragon effect, your opponent will likely be down on life points. You'll probably have sunk them a little bit low over the course of the game up to that point already. And if you just search out a monster that can deal 3,400 damage to them right away, then that is potentially more consistent than the Yata Lock. And also, Injection Fairy Lily is less of a brick than Yata in general. So, a lot of people have pivoted towards other things with Chaos Emperor Dragon, but even if the Chaos Yata Lock isn't necessarily the most consistent thing, the power of this card itself is still very, very strong, and a very, very scary card, arguably more scary than Black Left's Soldier Envoy of the beginning. But these cards make it so that, having a light and dark monster in your graveyard, very, very powerful, and you need to sort of build your deck around these cards, or build your deck in a way that can combat these sorts of strategies. There was also an additional Chaos monster released in Invasion of Chaos, and that is Chaos Sorcerer. Chaos Sorcerer is a dark level 6 spellcaster with 2,300 attack, 2,000 defense. says, cannot be normal summoned or set. Must first be special summoned from your hand by banishing 1 light and 1 dark monster from your graveyard. Once per turn, you can target 1 face-up monster in the field, banish that target. This card cannot attack the turn you activate this effect. Now, a lot of people overlook this card in favor of Chaos Ember Dragon and Black Luster Soldier, and that is fair. These cards are just objectively better than Chaos Sorcerer, but having Chaos Sorcerers in your deck as well can be pretty good. Just having more Chaos monsters you can special summon out with a lot of attack that can, have these powerful effects can be very good. So a lot of people have sort of gone back to this format and reevaluate Chaos Sorcerer, said maybe, we should put this card in the deck as well. So definitely something to consider when you're building a Chaos deck for yourself. Next up, we've got Dark Magician of Chaos, which is, it has Chaos in the name, so technically a Chaos monster, but doesn't really have the same summoning mechanic as the other Chaos monsters here. It's a level 8 monster that has also been errated. So, ignore the part that says during the end phase. Basically, when this card is normal summoned or special summoned, you can target 1 spell in your graveyard, add it to your hand, which is extremely powerful. And then if this card destroys an opponent's monster by battle, it is banished. And when this card is removed from the field, it is indeed banished. So, this is a very, very powerful card. Although having it be 2 tribute kind of balances out a little bit. Could be a major brick if you draw it and you don't have a way to get it out on the field that easily. But its effect can easily make up for that. And there are decks that aim to sort of cheat this card out. You can banish it off of something like a Black Luster Soldier or a Chaos Ember Dragon, and then use a card that I'll discuss later called Dimension Fusion to bring it back. I'll be discussing strategies using this card a little bit more later in the video, but it is a potential option you can do to sort of get this card out more easily. But even for decks that aren't doing that, this card is a potential card to consider, just having it as a one-of that you can potentially bring out off of 2 tributes and get a powerful spell back. So very, very good card to know about here. Next up, we've got Berserk Gorilla. This is a 2,000 attack point monster, level 4 beast that says if this card is in face-up defense position, destroy this card must attack if able. Now I bring it up on this list because, in the past, monsters with 2,000 or more attack on level 4 monster have had major, major downsides. Things like Jiragumo having your life points, Goblin Attack Force switching to defense with 0 defense afterwards. Things like that. Berserk Gorilla is arguably the level 4 monster with 2,000 or more attack that has the least downside. The face-up defense position thing can come up occasionally, but there aren't as many ways to switch it to defense. Also, the must attack if able isn't really that big of a deal if your opponent just has weaker monsters, and if they do have a stronger monster, you can just switch to the defense, destroy it that way, and be fine. So I think Berserk Gorilla is a pretty good card that, a deck in general should consider if they want a bigger beat stick. Next up, we've got the spells, starting with Smashing Ground. Very powerful spell card. Normal spell that says destroy the 1 face-up monster your opponent controls that has the highest defense, your choice if tied. This can be a very versatile removal spell, although in a format with things like Raigeki, like Dark Hole, etc., you could argue that a spell that is not as powerful as those isn't really worth playing here, but it is still a very good card to know about, worth siding at least, I'd say. And, I think with further exploration, this card could potentially become even better. Next up, we've got DD Designator. This is a normal spell that says declare 1 card name, look at your opponent's hand, and if they have the declared card in their hand, remove from play that 1 card. If they do not have the declared card in their hand, banish 1 random card in your hand. Now, this card isn't really seeing much play from what I've seen, but there are some powerful things you can pair with it. For instance, Trap Dust Shoot is legal at 3 copies in this format, so if you are playing Trap Dust Shoots, having DD Designator is another way you can rip apart your opponent's hand. Or just if you've got a play that loses to a card that might be in your opponent's hand, you could just fire this blind and try and go for it that way. But either way, I think that having this sort of card here can be pretty good. It could be at least a good side deck option against certain decks, so it is good to know about. Next up, we got the trap, starting with Compulsory Evacuation Device. This is a normal trap that says target 1 monster on the field, return that target to hand. Now, this is very, very powerful in later formats in the game's history. In this format, I'm not really sure how good it is. Things like the Chaos monsters don't really mind being back in the hand. I mean, your opponents use resources to bring them out, but, they can always just bring them out again if they have more resources in their grave. So I don't really think Compulsory Evacuation Device is the best card in this format. It is, however, good to know about, and it is a generic card that any deck can play. So I do think that is worth talking about here. Next up, we got some counter traps. We've got first, Curse Seal of the Forbidden Spell. This is a counter trap that says when a spell card is activated, discard one spell, negate the activation if you do destroy it. If you do that, your opponent cannot activate spells with the same name for the rest of the duel. Now, I think this card is a lot worse in this format than it might seem, because a lot of the spells that your opponent will be firing that you want to negate are things like the limited power spells. And firing Curse Seal, you do negate that spell, but you don't get the added benefit of stopping any other spells with that name later on. I mean, there are things like Magician of Faith that can add back spells from the graveyard, so you're shutting off that avenue, I guess. But your opponent can always just add back another powerful spell from the graveyard off Magician of Faith. So I don't really think Curse Seal is that good in general, but it can be played just as a general spell negate in a deck. Next up, we got Trap Jammer. This is a counter trap that says when your opponent activates a trap card during the battle phase, negate the activation if you do destroy it. Now, the issue with this is that, like, a lot of the time your opponent isn't using traps in the battle phase. Of course, there is Mirror Force. Call of the Haunted can potentially come up. There are also things like Sakuretsu Armor that are in this format that, you do have to be a little bit wary of. But on the whole, battle traps aren't the biggest issue with, like, a lot of the pushes that you're making. So I think the Trap Jammer is not really the best here. It is potentially something that you can play if you are worried about your opponent's traps, but I think that in general, it's not really the best. Next up, we've got Chain Disappearance. It's a normal trap that says when a monster with 1,000 or less attack is summoned, banish that monster with 1,000 or less attack. Then your opponent banishes all cards with the same name as that card from their hand and deck. So, like Curse Seal, I don't really foresee the second part being that useful. Of course, there are edge cases, like if your opponent flip summons a Magician of Faith, you can get rid of the other Magician of Faiths in their deck, for instance. But the reason I want to put it here is that this card can be very powerful against things like Sangan or Sinister Serpent. Now, those are just two cards out of a deck, so is it worth playing it, just to hit those cards? Maybe not, but those cards are very powerful. It can also stop something like Yatagarasu, for instance, like Injection Fairy Lily. So there are a surprising amount of cards that this card can hit in your opponent's deck. And so I do want to talk about it here as a potential card that you could potentially play. Now, in addition to these new cards that Invasion of Chaos added, I want to take some time just to cover the cards already in this format that are good to know about and potentially play in your decks. Firstly, starting with the monsters, we've got Gravekeeper's Spy. Gravekeeper's Spy is a very, very powerful monster that's flip monster, 1,200 attack, 2,000 defense, dark, says special summon one Gravekeeper's monster, 1,500 less attack for your deck. If you're just playing 3 spies, you can bring out another spy. That's another dark monster on your side of the field, 2,000 defense is nothing to scoff at. And it can be very good at deck thinning, getting another dark and grave for your chaos monsters. Very, very powerful. This card has seen a lot of sort of reevaluation in revisiting these formats, and the more people have played with it, the more people have realized this card is really, really good. So I do think that this card is a very, very good card to consider as a dark in this format. Speaking of good darks to consider, we've got Kaiku the Ghost Destroyer. This card is really, really good this format. Dark monster level 4, 1,800 attack, 700 defense. It says when this card inflicts battle damage to your opponent, you can target up to 2 monsters in their graveyard, banish those targets. Your opponent cannot banish cards from either graveyard. And this is really, really good because it stops your opponent's chaos monsters from coming out. If you're able to attack in a couple times with it, you can get rid of lights and darks that your opponent would want to potentially bring out their chaos monsters. And so this card is very, very good to know about. Next up, we've got DD Warrior Lady. This is a level 4 warrior monster with 1,500 attack, 1,600 defense. It is a light. It says after damage calculation, when this card battles an opponent's monster, you can banish that monster, also banish this card. So this card is very, very good at dealing with your opponent's threats. It's also good at being a light. So, if this card winds up in the graveyard, you've got a light for your chaos monsters. Although oftentimes this card will be getting banished, so it is a bit unfortunate in that regard. Next up, we've got Magician of Faith. Magician of Faith is a level 1 light spellcaster. It says flip target 1 spell in your grave, add that target to your hand. This can be very good at recycling a lot of the very powerful spells in this format. It also is a light monster for your chaos monsters. There are also some other things you can do with, like Metamorphosis, for instance. Bring out like 1,000 Heads Restrict off this. Although the Goat Control Serve deck is not quite as good this format based on how Tsukiyomi actually works in this format. So I don't really think that we'll see much play, but just having a light is very, very good. And speaking of lights, we've also got Shining Angel. This is a level 4 light monster, light fairy, 1,400 attack, 800 defense. When this card is destroyed by battle and sent to the graveyard, you can summon 1 light monster with 1,500 or less attack from your deck and face-up attack position. So this can be very good at getting lights engraved, deck thinning a little bit. It can also go into things like DD Warrior Lady. Now, speaking of DD Warrior Lady, the big flaw with this card is that, DD Warrior Lady can clear it, prevent you from getting a light engrave, and not get its effect off. But I have seen this card seeing some play in this format because it is just a very good light, and lights are nothing to scoff at here. And speaking of lights that can potentially do something, we've also got Thunder Dragon. Thunder Dragon is a level 5 Thunder monster, 1600 attack, 1500 defense, light monster. You can discard this card, add up to 2 Thunder Dragons from your deck to your hand. So if you do want to get lights engraved, this is a good way to do it. Also, deck thins makes it more likely that you're going to draw into your Chaos monsters. However, it can be a little bit of a brick, as it doesn't really do anything in your hand. So that is good to consider in a format when there are so many powerful cards that actually do stuff. Do you really want this brick in hand? That's a debate for people who are deck building in this format, but I do think that Thunder Dragon can see play, and maybe we'll see a sort of like Chaos Turbo sort of deck arise playing Thunder Dragon in addition to other cards. Next up, we've got some spells that I want to mention. The most important spell not on the limited list is Mystical Space Typhoon. This is a quick play spell. It says target 1 spell or trap card on the field, destroy that target. This card is basically a mandatory 3 of in most decks because, it stops Imperial Order, it stops Mirage of Nightmare, it stops just your opponent's back row that you're scared of. This card is very, very powerful, arguably more powerful than something like Heavy Storm or Harpy's Feather Duster in this format. So it is good to play 3 of it. Next up, we've got Book of Moon. This is a quick play spell that says target 1 face-up monster on the field, change that target to face-down defense position. This is in the format of 3 copies. A lot of people don't really play it as much because, there are just better spells and traps that you can play. This is good to know about. It has seen play in a lot of later formats, so with reevaluation, maybe this card will see more play here. So it's definitely very good to know about, and a card to consider if you're building a deck. Next up, we've got Traps, starting with Bottomless Trap Hole. I think this card is a card that could definitely see play in this format as a way to stop your Chaos monsters from doing things. If your opponent brings out like a Black Leather Soldier Envoy at the beginning, you can Bottomless Trap Hole it, prevent them from doing anything on field. Now, the issue with this is that both Black Leather Soldier and Chaos Ember Dragon Envoy at the end can use their effects with priority, so that will basically dodge around Bottomless Trap Hole. But, if your opponent just wants it as a beat stick, then you can use Bottomless Trap Hole, clear it away, and be pretty good. So definitely a card to consider here. Of course, when Torrential Tribute is in this format, 3 copies, you want to play Bottomless Trap Hole or Torrential Tribute. Probably the Torrential Tribute, but Bottomless Trap Hole does banish, so that is something good to consider. However, speaking of Torrential Tribute, this is also a very, very good card to know about and potentially play in your decks. It is at 3 copies. It's a normal trap that says when a monster is summoned, destroy all monsters on the field. Very, very powerful board clear that a lot of decks are playing. Next up, we've got Dust Tornado and Royal Decree. Both of these are more side deck cards than main deck cards, but I can see certain decks playing them in the main deck. Dust Tornado is a normal trap that says target 1 spell or trap your opponent controls, destroy that target. Then you can set 1 spell or trap card from your hand. That second part doesn't really come up all too often, but it can be useful in certain edge cases. The main reason you bring this in is if your opponent's on a more back row heavy deck, this can be good to deal with that. Same with Royal Decree. Royal Decree is a continuous trap that says negate all other trap effects on the field. This can be good if you're going for like certain OTKs and you do just want to shut down all of your opponent's interaction with you. But the main use for this in a lot of decks is just in the side deck to bring in against certain back row heavy decks. So very, very good to know about there. For more traps, we got Sakuretsu Armor. Sakuretsu Armor is a normal trap that says when an opponent's monster declares attack, target the attacking monster to destroy that target. So this is very good at just stopping individual monsters that your opponent might have. May not be as powerful as Mirror Force, but it can come up and it can be pretty devastating for your opponent, just losing that tempo. Next up, we've got Solemn Judgment. Solemn Judgment is a counter trap that says when a monster would be summoned or a spell or trap card is activated, pay half your life points to negate the summoner activation, and if you do, destroy that card. Now, Solemn is a very, very risky card in this format. When Chaos Ember Dragon Envoy the End exists, dropping down that low with Solemn can be very, very risky. However, there are cases where Solemn can come up and be very, very powerful. I mean, we've seen that in a lot of formats. This card just can be super, super strong if used correctly, but, that is a bit of a risk as well. So I'm not sure that this card will see much play overall, but, if you are confident in your skills as a player and you do want to play this card as another control tool, this card can be very good. And lastly, we've got Trap Death Shoot. Now, Trap Death Shoot is a card that, a lot of people aren't really using in this format because you do have the hand rips like, Forceful Sentry, Confiscation, Liquid Duo, etc. So Trap Death Shoot doesn't really see as much play as in later formats like Goat or Edison, but it is still a good card to know about. And again, paired with DD Designator, it's very strong. It can also potentially shuffle back monsters into your opponent's deck, so that will potentially stop them from hitting the grave and setting up more chaos monsters for your opponent. So it is a potential card to consider here, and that's why I'm mentioning it here. Now, before I move on to the next section, I do want to mention the fusion monsters that are around in this format and are potentially relevant, because, magical scientists does exist, metamorphosis does exist, so there are potential situations where you'd see these guys come out. So firstly, let's start with Dark Balter the Terrible, level 5 monster. And, a fusion summon of this monster can only be conducted with the above fusion materials, but that will almost never come up because you're not going to hard fusion summon this. It says, when a normal spell is activated, negate the effect by paying 1,000 life points. The effect of an effect monster that this monster destroys as a result of battle is negated. So very, very strong target to bring off Scientist or off Metamorphosis. We also have Dark Flare Knight here, level 6 monster, Dark, 2200 attack, 800 defense. Says you take no battle damage from battles involving this card. When this card is destroyed in a battle and sent to the graveyard, summon 1 Mirage Knight from your hand or deck. That second part is not really that important. Mainly the attack stat here is what's important for bringing out off of Scientist. We also got Dark Fire Dragon and Dragoness the Wicked Knight as your level 4 and level 3 Metamorphosis targets potentially. These are the monsters with the highest attack on a level 3 and level 4 target. Although, Dragoness itself is a wind monster, so you might not want to play it. You might want to play something like Flame Ghost instead, which is the level 3 target that is dark, that is the highest attack. 1,000 versus 1,200, not really that big of a difference, so you might as well play the Flame Ghost instead, just for the potential Chaos typing synergy there. We've got Fiend Skull Dragon as well, level 5, Wind Monster, 2,000 attack, 1,200 defense. Fusion summon this card can only be done with the above fusion materials. Again, that won't really matter. Negate the effect of flip effect monsters, negate any trap that targets this card in the field, and if you do destroy that trap. This can be good. Generally, you want to bring up Balter if you're attacking into a set monster, but it can be good if you are worried about things like Sakurai's Armor, Ring of Destruction, etc. Fiend Skull Dragon can fulfill that niche instead. Next up, I talked about Flame Ghost, but there's also the level 3 Fusionist. If you want a monster with the lowest attack stat on a fusion monster, that is Fusionist, attack 900, defense 700, and it's an Earth, so it doesn't have the Chaos typing, but there are potential situations where you would want a very low attack position monster to bring it off Scientist. And because the Fusion deck is unlimited at this point in time, so you can have access to 3 copies of each of these cards, you can potentially, basically play other cards in your Fusion deck, on Bloombook and then just sort of proxy in this card. But, it's good to know about as a potential stat line on a fusion monster here. Next up, we've got Guiltia the D Knight. This is a level 5 light monster, 1850 attack, 1500 defense. The reason I'm including this here is the highest attack on a Scientist target that is light. So again, for Chaos typing, this can be pretty important here. Next up, we got Reaper on the Nightmare, level 5 Dark Monster, 800 attack, 600 defense. Says this card is not destroyed as a result of battle. Destroy this card when it's targeted by the effect of a spell, trap, or effect monster. This card can attack your opponent's life points directly, even if there is a monster on your opponent's side of the field. If this card successfully attacks your opponent's life points directly, your opponent discards 1 card randomly from his or her hand. So this can be very good if you're able to bring it off of something like Metamorphosis, attack in for 800, and then rip a card out of their hand. That can be very, very strong, although it doesn't come up often in this format. Next up, we've got Ryu Sentry, level 6, Fusion Monster, Earth, 2,000 attack, 1,200 defense. Fusion summon of this card can only be done with the above fusion materials. Again, won't really come up that often. And then when a normal trap card is activated, you can pay 1,000 life points to negate that effect. This card must be face up on the field to activate and resolve this effect. And also negate the effect of any spell card that target this card and destroy it. This can be a very annoying card for your opponent to deal with. It can also be used just to push for a fair amount of damage, insulate your OTK pushes. So it is good in that regard as well. Next up, we've got Super Robo Lady and Super Robo Yaru. These cards probably won't come up that often, but they do have their edge cases. So Super Robo Yaru, it's kind of weird. They both have the effect to special summon out the other one from your extra deck at some point in the turn, but it can't be the turn that they're summoned, so it likely won't come up. You can't use Scientist to bring out one of these and bring out the other and attack directly, for instance. But if you're using Metamorphosis, for instance, then this effect can potentially come up. But something good to potentially know about. In addition, increase the attack of this monster by 1,000 life point or 1,000 attack points during the damage step when this monster battles with a monster. So this can be good to bring out, dealing with monsters through Messenger of Peace and still hitting the stat line of Dark Flare Knight. So that's good to know about for Super Robo Yaru. Super Robo Lady probably won't come up with Scientist, but it is potentially good to know about. It increases the attack of this monster by 1,000 points during the damage step when it inflicts direct damage to your opponent. And also it has the same clause as Super Robo Yaru, where you can special summon out the Super Robo Yaru instead. These are also both machines, so they can pair with limit removal potentially. Next up, we've got some cards that are not science targets. Last Word from Another Planet, level 7 monster. 2350 attack, 2300 defense. If this card is special summon, destroy all other monsters you control. Neither player can special summon monsters. Now, this is level 7, so you can't bring it off Scientist, but if you like Metamorphosis this into it, or if you hard fusion summon into it, it can lock down the board. So it's a good card to know about. Speaking of level 7 monsters, we also have Twin and Thunder Dragon, level 7 light monster, 20 enter attack, 21 defense. That's all it is. But I figured I'd mention it because it is a high attack light target that you can potentially see. People are playing Thunder Dragons, so you could potentially hard fusion into this. It's just good to know about. And lastly, probably the most relevant fusion monster in this format, we've got Thousand Eyes Restrict. Thousand Restrict is a scientist target, so you can bring it off scientist, suck up your opponent's monster, and be very good that way. It says other monsters on the field cannot change their battle position or attack. Once per turn, you can target one monster your opponent controls, equip that target to this card. This card's attack and defense become equal to that equipped monster's. If this card would be destroyed by battle, destroy that equipped monster instead. So, with Scientists, you're just kind of using this as spot removal, basically. But you can also potentially metamorphosis out using something like a Magician of Faith or a Scapegoat token, because Scapegoat is also legal in this format at 3 copies, even if it isn't the best of this format. And so it is good to know about Thousand Eyes Restrict. I assume that people are going to try and make a goat control deck, even if it isn't the best of this format. So a very, very good card to know about and have in your own extra deck as well. But that's going to do it for the generally good stuff for this format that I wanted to talk about. From here on out, we're going to get into more specific strategies. That doesn't necessarily mean these strategies are bad. It just means that they're more specific. So to start off with, let's talk about the sort of more specific chaos stuff. If you want to go like all in on chaos or banishing cards, this is what you could potentially do. So let's say you wanted to go all in on chaos. What are the things you can do with it? Well, firstly, let's talk about the boss monsters. So the boss monsters are still the same. They're Black Cloud Soldier Envoy at the beginning, Chaos Ember Dragon Envoy at the end, and Chaos Sorcerer. And these all require you to banish cards from your graveyard. So this then asks the question, what are the best light and dark targets that you can play? So if we're talking about all the light and dark targets that, sort of are in the card pool already and are potentially good to know about, then starting with the dark monsters are generally easier because you've got things like Sandman with Black Forest, Magical Scientist. I mean, a lot of the very powerful monsters in Yu-Gi-Oh! At this time are dark. But if you're just worried about things like attack stats and the highest attack stats, then the highest attack stat on a level 4 monster without any drawbacks is 1900. And, 3 monsters have this attack stat: Archfiend Soldier, Mad Dog of Darkness, and Skilled Dark Magician. Now, Skilled Dark Magician is my least favorite of the 3 because it has 1700 attack, so it can't be searched out by something like Witch of the Black Forest. Also, it has an effect that says each time spell card is activated, place 1 spell counter on this card, and then you contribute this card with 3 spell counters on it, special summon 1 Dark Magician from your hand, deck, or graveyard. This does give your opponent a potential out to this card if they like Change of Heart it or Snatch Steal it, and that's like the 3rd spell counter on this. They can then tribute that out and fail to find a Dark Magician in their deck, because fail to find is still a thing in this format. So this card isn't my favorite for a variety of reasons, but if you do want the more defense, 1700 defense isn't like the worst stat in this format, so it is something to consider that way. Of Archfiend Soldier and Mad Dog of Darkness, I generally prefer Archfiend Soldier because it does have 100 more defense than Mad Dog of Darkness. But Mad Dog of Darkness can come up given it's a beast, and certain beast strategies might want to use this. But I'll get into the beast strategies later on in the video. If you just want the level 4 dark monster that you don't necessarily care about the drawbacks, I'd say that Zombard of the Dark is the best of those. It's searchable off of Reinforced from the Army because it is a warrior monster with level 4 or less. It's 2100 attack. It is a dark. Cannot attack directly. If this card destroys a monster by battle, this card loses 200 attack. There is also Giant Orc, which has 2200 attack, and so that might be slightly better. But I think that being able to be searchable off Reinforced the Army puts Zombard of the Dark over the edge for me. But that's what we're talking about in terms of like bigger attack stats. If you want my opinion on the best Dark Beast stick to play, that is definitely Kaiku the Ghost Destroyer, as I mentioned in the last section of the video. I mean, this card is just really, really good at shutting off your opponent's Chaos plays and also setting up your own. So a very, very good card to know about. Next up, let's talk about the light monsters. The light monsters are a lot more sort of interesting to discuss because light monsters are a lot worse than dark monsters in Yu-Gi-Oh! At this time, which means that you kind of have to scrape the bottom of the barrel a little bit to get good light monsters to play in this deck. Now, I've already talked about Shining Angel, I've already talked about Thunder Dragon, I've already talked about DD Warley, and I've already talked about Magician of Faith in the previous section, but there are a fair amount of other light monsters to talk about as well. Firstly, we've got a Sure Priest, the level 4 spirit monster, which means that, it can't be special summoned, and during the end phase of the turn, it is normal summon flip face up, it's returned in the hand. But it can attack all monsters your opponent control once each. This can be very good at going through your opponent's recruiters, be very good at dealing with scapegoat tokens, things like that. However, dealing with recruiters with this card is kind of a double-edged sword in this format, given that, then that gets your opponent a lot of like lights or darks engraved respectively, and so you don't necessarily want to do that. So I'm not really sure if this card is worth playing in the main deck in this format. Maybe a side deck card if your opponent is on Scapegoat. But other than that, I don't really think this card will see much play. Next up, we got Banisher of the Light. Banisher of the Light is a very interesting light monster, 100 attack, 2000 defense. And this is also kind of like Kaiku. This is kind of anti-chaos tech as well. This says any card sent to the graveyard is banished instead. So if you have this card up, any monster that your opponent has is going to be sent to the banish zone instead of the graveyard. So this will deprive them of cards engraved to banish for their chaos monsters. Also, if they do clear this monster, then that'll be a light engrave for you. So it kind of works out better for you in the long run. However, this is kind of a double-edged sword because it will banish your own cards as well. So you won't be able to set up your graveyard for chaos plays while this card fades up on the field. But you probably have ways around this. Like you could play tribute monsters like Jinzo or Dark Lord of Death, treat this card off, get a light engrave, and then have a powerful monster on field as well. So I think this card is definitely worth considering as a light monster, although it is a bit risky, and that is good to worry about. Next up, we got Free the Brave Wanderer. This is also a warrior, so it has that benefit there. Light, 1700 attack, 1200 defense. So once per turn, you can banish 2 light monsters from your graveyard to target 1 face-up monster on the field with higher attack than this face-up card. Destroy that target. So this is really only a useful effect if you're playing a ton of light monsters, and you can potentially play a sort of light deck, just leaning all into the light monsters, playing things potentially like Thunder Nyan Nyan as well, which is a 1900 light monster that destroys itself if there's a non-light monster on your side of the field. But its effect does like sort of take away light monsters from your chaos monsters, so that is something to consider as well. However, being able to destroy a monster on the field with higher attack than this card can be a decent enough effect to still see play. So I do think that Freed is good to consider at least. Next up, we got Hysteric Fairy, which is the level 4 or lower light monster without a sort of drawback to it that has the highest attack. And it says, tribute 2 monsters on your side of the field to increase your life points by 1,000 points. That won't necessarily come up that often, but its 1800 attack and light stat line does make it, worth considering for making this light deck. Next up, we've got Jagan the Spiritualist. Jagan is a level 3 light monster, 200 attack, 1300 defense. Says you can discard 1 random card from your hand to the graveyard, destroy all special summon monsters on the field. Neither player can special summon monsters. So this can be good both as sort of like an anti-chaos tech against your opponent, because you bring this out, discard a card, destroy your opponent's chaos monsters. You can also prevent your opponent from bringing out more chaos monsters, so it's good in that way as well. However, this card is very, very weak, so if your opponent has any non-chaos monster, they can just summon out and hit over it. They can just do that. So I don't really think this card is the best as a light monster in these decks, but it is definitely interesting to consider. Next up, we got Magical Merchant. It's a level 1 flip monster, just like Magician of Faith. It's a light, 200 attack, 700 defense. It says flip, excavate card from the top of your deck until you excavate a spell trap, then add that card to your hand. Also send the remaining cards to the graveyard. So this can be very good at getting more monsters engraved for your chaos monsters, also getting a spell trap card to hand, which is also nice. So this is definitely a card to consider as well as the light target in your deck. However, it can be a bit risky. You can potentially mill no monsters, potentially mill monsters like your chaos monsters. So this is also sort of like a risky card, kind of like Banisher is a risky card. This is also risky. So just good to keep in mind. Next up, we got Reflect Bound. It's a level 4, 1700 attack point monster, light. And I already talked about in the limited list section of the video. I don't necessarily think this card is the best, but it has a decent stat line. It has an annoying effect for your opponent to deal with a lot of the time. So I do think that it can potentially be good. It can also convert, like, if your opponent's bringing out a DD Warley to attack into your monster and get rid of it that way, it can deal a ton of damage to your opponent for doing that play. So I do think that, it's good to consider for that reason as well. But, ultimately, I'm not sure if I'd play this in a Chaos deck myself. Next up, we got Shining Angel. I mentioned this before, but Shining Angel is also very powerful to bring out any of the sort of light monsters that I've discussed here with 1500 or less attack as well. So good to consider in that regard. And I just wanted to mention it here again, as this is a light monster that sees a lot of play from what I've seen of the format so far. Next up, we got Summoner of Illusions, level 3, flip monster, 800 attack, 900 defense, light. Flip, tribute one other monster, and if you do, special summon one fusion monster from your extra deck, but destroy it during the end phase of this turn. Now, this is a bit of a weird effect and a bit of a weird cost. You do have to tribute another monster, so it's not going to pull off all the time. But there are some other light monsters that you can bring out from your fusion deck. For instance, Guilty of the D-Knight, St. Joan, Twin-Headed Thunder Dragon, I mentioned on the previous page. So, Summoner of Illusions is potentially good at getting not just one, but 2 light monsters in your graveyard for the price of 1, and also potentially stopping your opponent's aggressive push. Although, if you've got 2 monsters on field, you're likely already going to stop that aggressive push, but it is good to consider at least. And lastly, the Thunder Yan Yan. I mentioned this for the Freed the Brave Wanderer, just as a component of a pure light deck. But I do think that it is worth noting that, if you do need an instant light monster in grave and you have a dark monster on field, you can summon this out, it destroys itself, get that instant light monster in grave, then go for a chaos monster. So good to consider in that way as well. But now that I've covered all these darks and lights, these are just good cards to consider if you are going in for the chaos deck, but there are some just cards that play well with chaos cards in general. For instance, DD Scoutplane. This is a dark level 2 machine, 800 attack, 1200 defense. Says during the end phase of this card is currently banished and was banished this turn, special summon in face up attack position. This effect can only activate once per turn. The great thing about this is if you banish it for something like a Chaos Orc, a Chaos Emperor Dragon, or a Black Leather Soldier, you then get it back at the end of the turn. It can then be used for more chaos fodder later on in the game. So it's basically a dark that recycles itself constantly, and that can be very good at just keeping your chaos monsters online always. However, the issue with this is that, again, as I mentioned earlier, your dark monsters are already going to be pretty good, and you don't necessarily need more dark monsters in the graveyard. If this card was a light, it would see instant play. This would be an insane light target. But as a dark, it's kind of not really as necessary. Now, that being said, there are also cases where you use it as a tribute fodder for something like a Dark Magician of Chaos, which, is a very powerful monster that I mentioned on the sort of general good stuff section of the video. But I think in general, this card is only going to see play in very specific sorts of decks. But speaking of Dark Magician of Chaos, I mentioned that I'd be discussing this card in more detail, and here's the time to do it, because it does pair well with another spell, Dimension Fusion. Dimension Fusion is a normal spell that says pay 2,000 life points. Both players special summon as many of their removed from play monsters as possible. This card also pairs well with the Chaos monsters too, because you are banishing cards to bring them out, and then you Dimension Fusion to get a ton of monsters on your side of the field. And if you banish something like a Dark Magician of Chaos, you can then get a spell card back from your graveyard on top of that. It could either be the Dimension Fusion that you just, activated, because that will go to grave before Dark Magician of Chaos's effect triggers, or it could be something like a Harpy Feather Duster to go for a major push. It can be something like Graceful Charity to draw more. There's just a ton of things that you can do there. And so Dimension Fusion is very good in any deck that is playing Dark Magician of Chaos there. If you want a janky way to get Dark Magician of Chaos out, though, as well, we've got Dedication through Light and Darkness, the quick play spell that says tribute 1 Dark Magician, spell summon 1 Dark Magician of Chaos from your hand deck or graveyard. I don't think this is the best strategy. Dark Magician is already kind of hard to bring out, even if you are using something like Skill Dark Magician. But it is a funny way to get Dark Magician of Chaos out, and also, getting Dark Magician of Chaos out is just so powerful. So I do think it is something to know about if you do want to go all in on the Dark Magicians of Chaos. Now, speaking of Dimension Fusion again, there are some other cards that either benefit from it or, sort of fuel it as well. The first of those being Bazoo the Soul Eater. Bazoo the Soul Eater is a card from Labyrinth of Nightmare. It's a beast that says 1 per turn, you can banish up to 3 monsters from your graveyard. This card gains 300 attack for each until the end of your opponent's turn. So basically what you can do is summon up Bazoo the Soul Eater, banish 3 monsters from your graveyard, go for Dimension Fusion, and get a ton of monsters on field. This card could see play in decks that are trying to take advantage of Dark Magician of Chaos and Dimension Fusion. But, when you've got the Chaos monsters, it's arguable whether you need this card or not. So, it's a good card to consider, but ultimately, I'm not sure if many decks will play this. Next up, we got Sacred Crane. Sacred Crane is another light target if you are going for a light. This is a 1600 attack point monster, 400 defense. So if this card is special summon, draw 1 card. So this can be very good to bring out off Dimension Fusion as well as you draw an additional card with it. Also, if you are trying to bring out Dark Magician of Chaos with something like Reasoning, if you play Sacred Cranes in your deck and they hit that, then you'll be able to draw a card. I'm sure people who have seen GOAT do know that, there is a deck in that format called Reasoning Gate where you are playing Reasoning, you are playing Monster Gate to bring out Sacred Crane and Dark Magician of Chaos. Unfortunately, Monster Gate is not legal in this format, so that means that you can't quite be as consistent with the deck as you would be in that format. And it also makes Reasoning, in my opinion, not really the best card to play in this format, as, your opponent's just always going to call level 8, as bringing out a Dark Magician of Chaos off Reasoning is very powerful, and if you're playing Reasoning, you likely are playing Dark Magician of Chaos. So I don't really like this card that much in this format, although it can see play in some sort of janky off-meta decks. For instance, you might not even be playing Dark Mystery Chaos at all. You could just be playing big beaters like Guardian Angel Joan, which is a level 7, light monster, 2000 attack, 2000 defense. When this card destroys a monster by battle in the graveyard, gain life points equal to that original monster's attack in grave. It's another light monster. If your opponent just calls 8, they're not going to expect this. So it can potentially be something that you play off of Reasoning, but I don't really think Reasoning is that good in this format. Next up, we've got Strike Ninja. Strike Ninja is another monster to fuel your grave, or fuel your Dimension Fusion, and it's just a very annoying card for your opponent to deal with in general. To quick effect, you can banish 2 Dark Monsters from your graveyard, banish this card face up until the end phase. You can only use this effect, Strike Ninja, once per turn. So the idea is if your opponent uses something that would remove Strike Ninja, you can banish 2 monsters from grave, banish it, and then be fine. And then you can use something like Dimension Fusion to bring back all those monsters later. However, the issue with this is that if you are going for the Strike Ninja play, you will be leaving yourself a bit open, and your opponent can attack in, drop you down pretty low in life points, and then the Dimension Fusion is a lot less appetizing because you'll have to pay 2,000 life points on top of that. So I think the Strike Ninja, I'm not really sure how I feel about it in this format. It's definitely something you can experiment with. And Strike Ninja decks have seen success in other formats. Just I'm not really sure if Chaos format is the format for it. But if we're talking about banishing a ton of stuff, there is also another monster that can benefit from that, and that is Gren Maju Daiza. Gren Maju Daiza is a level 3 fire monster with question mark attack, question mark defense, and that is because this card's attack and defense become the number of your banished cards times 400. So you're banishing a ton of monsters from your graveyard with something like Strike Ninja or Bazoo or etc. Then Gren Maju Daiza can be pretty buffed up, and it can just be a big beater that can just deal a ton of damage to your opponent. Now, getting to the point where this card does have a ton of attack is really difficult in this format, so I don't really think this card will see much play. But it is kind of a funny card, at least, and a card to consider if you do want to sort of break that sort of idea. Next up, we've got Witch Doctor of Chaos. It's a level 2 flip monster. This is select one monster from you or your opponent's graveyard, banish it. So this can be good at stopping your opponent's sort of chaos strategy. It can also be good at potentially fueling your own Gren Maju Daiza. You can also banish a DD Scout plane, get that back at the end of the turn. So this card is a little bit versatile. I think it is a little bit too slow, however. However, you can bring this out off of Apprentice Magician, so that's kind of fun in that way. And if you are playing like an Apprentice Magician package to get more Darks Engraved, to have access to Magician of Faith potentially, then this card could be a good card to slot into that as well. Next up, we get Chaos Rider Gustav. Chaos Rider Gustav is a Wind Warrior, level 4, 1400 attack, 1500 defense. Says once per turn, you can banish up to 2 spells from your graveyard. This card gains 300 attack for each card banished by this effect until the end of your opponent's turn. And this can be decent. It gets you up to 2,000 attack, which is nothing to scoff at, as I mentioned when I talked about Berserk Gorilla. However, spells are often stuff that you want to keep in grave to sort of play with things like Magician Faith and things like that. This card isn't really the best, although there are some synergies with some other Chaos cards in this format, namely Chaos End and Chaos Greed, as well as DD Borderline. Chaos End says you can only activate this card if 7 or more of your cards are currently removed from play. Destroy all monsters on the field. This is basically a board wipe. It's basically a dark hole, but it's very conditional. You need to have 7 or more of your cards banished. But your Chaos Rider Gustav can help you get there. Now, whether it's worth it having this sort of dark hole for that sort of high price of getting 7 Chaos cards, that's debatable, but I do think it's a good card to know about at least. Chaos Greed is probably a bit more viable than Chaos End, but it is still really weird. It says you can only activate this card if 4 or more of your cards are currently banished and there are no cards in your graveyard. Draw 2 cards from your deck. So it's basically Pot of Greed, but you do need to have no cards in your graveyard and 4 banished. So in that way, Chaos Rider Gustav can help with that, in addition to things like Bazoo and even things like Banisher of the Light as well. DD Borderline is a continuous spell that's a bit worse than the other 2 cards here. It says, while there are no spells in your graveyard, neither player can conduct their battle phase. So this is basically a stall card. However, it does die to MST. It also does prevent you from attacking, and that necessarily isn't the best. So I don't really think this card is the best, but it is an interesting card to consider at least. And next up, we've got a card to sort of help fuel these cards here, and that is Recycle. Recycle is a continuous spell that says during your standby phase, by paying 300 life points, select 1 non-monster card in your graveyard and return it to the bottom of your deck. So if you've got spells, traps, etc. in your grave, cluttering that up, preventing you from activating things like Chaos Greed or Chaos End, or I guess Chaos End is fine, but Chaos Greed or DD Borderline, then you can use Recycle, send things back to your deck. However, this is really bad, I think, in general, whether you want to use a continuous spell to sort of fuel the Chaos Greed or etc. I think it's a bit too slow as well, and it does that MST as well. So I don't really think this card's the best, but it is kind of funny if you do want to go for those strategies. Next up, we've got Dimension Distortion, which also pairs with Recycle, Chaos Greed, etc. So you can only activate this card if there are no cards in your graveyard. Select one removed from play monster and special summon it to your side of the field. So it's basically like, Dimension Fusion, but a lot worse. You can use this to bring out Dark Magician of Chaos as well, so I guess it's good for that way as well. But again, you have to have no cards in your graveyard, which is a bit of a high ask. Next up, we've got just two funny cards that won't really see much play, but they are good to mention here at least. Firstly, we've got Primal Seed. Primal Seed is a normal spell that says if Black Leather Soldier Envoy at the beginning or Chaos Emperor Dragon Envoy at the end is on the field, target two of your banished cards, add both of those targets to your hand. Now, this does set up a very funny loop potentially. If you're playing two Primal Seeds and a burn spell, let's say Sparks, for instance, and you have the BLS or the CD on your side of the field, you can activate Primal Seed. Well, I guess they have to be banished first. So if your Primal Seed and your Sparks are both banished first, and then you activate Primal Seed, and I guess you have to have like a banish for the light on field. So you can already see how complicated this loop is. Like, it's not going to happen often. But if you have banish for the light on field, in addition to a Black Leather Soldier or a Chaos Emperor Dragon, and you've got a Primal Seed and a Sparks already banished, you can activate Primal Seed, get back the Sparks and Primal Seed. The Primal Seed you just activated will get banished. You activate Sparks, deal 200 to your opponent. Sparks get banished, activate Primal Seed, add Primal Seed and Sparks to your hand. You just repeat that loop over and over again. You will eventually finish your opponent off. Again, very convoluted. Probably not going to happen that much, and that's why this card is not really that good. But, it is something to consider. And even if you're not using it for that, I guess it can just be used to get back monsters from your banish zone. Especially after you used up two monsters to bring out Black Leather Soldier or Chaos Emperor Dragon. Lastly, we got Soul Absorbent, continuous spell. It says if a card is banished, gain 500 life points for each. So every Chaos monster that you bring out is 1,000 life points. So I guess that's good in that regard. However, I don't necessarily think it's the best just having life point gain card. I feel like Solemn Wishes would probably be a better life point gain card because that would get you more life points overall, I think. But I don't know. This card is something to consider, I guess, if you are worried about your life points and you do want to buff yourself up. But that's going to do it for this section of the video. And I hope that this showed you that there are way more sort of chaos cards here than just Black Leather Soldier, Chaos Emperor Dragon, and Chaos Sorcerer. There's a lot of interesting things you can do with them. But, of course, when Chaos is the meta, there will also be a bunch of anti-meta Chaos cards to consider. So let's talk about those real briefly. Okay, where there's the meta, you gotta have the anti-meta as well. And that's what we got here. I just picked together a list of cards that I think could potentially see play in anti-meta sort of capacity. And let's start with Kaiku the Ghost Destroyer. So Kaiku the Ghost Destroyer, I mentioned it in both the sections of this video previously. But basically, your opponent can't banish monsters from the graveyard while it's on field. You can also banish monsters when it attacks in. So this can prevent your opponent from having monster engraved to banish with the chaos monsters. And thus, I think this card is a must include in any sort of good stuff deck. Very, very powerful card. And if you are going anti-meta, it is definitely a card that you should be playing. Also, DD Warrior Lady, a bit of an anti-meta card. Because you can banish your opponent's light targets. You can banish your opponent's dark targets. Just banishing cards with this can be pretty decent. Next up, Banish for the Light. This is more if you're going for the full anti-meta sort of strategy. It banishes any cards into the graveyard. So, if your opponent is trying to set up for their banish plays, this card can really put a wrench in those plans. Moving on from the monsters, though, we get into some of the spells that, are a bit more questionable. First, we've got Necro Valley. Necro Valley is a field spell. It says all Gravekeeper monsters gain 500 attack and defense. Card in the graveyard cannot be banished. And they also can't be targeted. Like, Necro Valley's gone through a lot of erratas. Basically, what you need to know is that, cards in the graveyard that use their own effects to move themselves away from the graveyard, are fine. But cards that try and move cards from the graveyard to other places, are not fine. So that's the way this effectively works in this format. And it can be good at just shutting off your opponent's sort of chaos plays. And that maybe Gravekeepers is a sort of anti-meta strategy that you can play in this format. As Gravekeepers did see success in Yada format in the past, and Gravekeeper Spy is already a very powerful card, so something to consider definitely for sure. And Necro Valley itself is just a decent anti-meta card here. Next up, we got Gravekeeper's Ghoul and Soul Release. Now, Gravedigger Ghoul is just the worst Soul Release. It says select up to 2 monsters in your opponent's graveyard, banish selected cards. Soul Release is much better because you can target up to 5 monsters in any graveyard, banish them. So Soul Release can even set up for your own, Dimension Fusion plays if you are playing Dimension Fusion. But yeah, Soul Release is the much better Gravedigger Ghoul, so you should really only play this. But if you do like max out on 3 copies of Soul Release and you do need one more card to go with it, then Gravedigger Ghoul is here for you. Next up, we got Big Burn. Big Burn says you can only activate this card when your opponent activates a card that targets a monster in the graveyard. Remove from play all monsters in both players' graveyards. Now, this is a bit iffy because, like, there are very few cards that actually do this. Things like Monster Reborn, Call the Haunted, Premature Burial. Those are basically the only cards that target a monster in your graveyard. So this is a very limited use, but if you do manage to use it and banish all monsters in your opponent's graveyard, that is very, very good because your opponent is able, like, to lose all the cards in their graveyard and they basically have to restart their chaos setup. So I think Big Burn isn't bad. It's just like very, very situational. Next up, we got Grave Robber's Retribution. This is easily the worst of the anti-meta techs, but it is kind of funny. It says during each of your standby phases, inflict 100 points of damage to your opponent's life points for each of your opponent's monsters that have been removed from play. So, if your opponent is banishing a ton to bring out the chaos monsters, then this deals damage to them. But like at max, I could really see this like dealing 500 damage to your opponent, and that's very, very rare. So I don't really think this card is that good, but it is kind of funny as an anti-meta tech. So that's going to do it for the sort of anti-meta section of this video. There are also ways to counter anti-meta stuff, like with Miracle Dig, for instance, where they can add monsters that are banished back to your graveyard. But I don't really think it's worth like mentioning that, as that card is really bad. And yeah, I mean, a lot of these cards are also pretty bad, but like there are some very, very good things to consider if you are planning on taking a more anti-meta tack. But speaking of things that aren't meta, let's dive into the tribal strategy for this format, because this Invasion of Chaos was not just good for the chaos monsters, it also introduced a lot of tools for a lot of jank strategies. Now, I could have split this section up into multiple sections, analyzing each of these different sort of tribes that you can play, but I figured it'd be more fun to just put it all on screen here and show you how much Invasion of Chaos actually added to these jank strategies. A lot of people just remember Invasion of Chaos for the Chaos Monsters, but the set was so much more. And it is just like, if you have been trying to make jank strategies work in previous DM era formats, then Chaos format is for you, because it gives you a lot of tools to do what you want to do. So let's start off with Warriors. Warriors is probably the most competent of these tribal strategies. And by tribal strategies, that has been strategies that revolve around a given type or attribute. And Warriors is a type. So, it is good to consider it as that sort of strategy. And Warrior Toolbox is a very good deck to consider. Namely, Reinforcing the Army makes it very, very searchable. So you can search out any of your tools that you need with the Warrior monsters. And, the Warrior monsters in Invasion of Chaos were not bad. I mean, I've already talked about Strike Ninja and Freed the Brave Wanderer, both being decent options here. Now, Freed is a bit more awkward if you're going pure Warriors, because there aren't as many light Warriors. DD Warrior Lady is one. But beyond that, there aren't too many others. I mean, there's Sasuke Samurai number 3, which is really bad. I mean, I'll talk about that shortly, but you don't necessarily want to be playing that. So Freed is a little bit awkward in a typical Warrior deck. But I do think that Strike Ninja has a bit more targets for that Warrior deck. Zambira, Donzalug, and additional copies of Strike Ninja as well. So if you are building a Chaos Warrior list, then Strike Ninja and Freed are something to consider. Mataza the Zapper is also a decent warrior. It's a dark level 3, 1300 attack, 800 defense. This card can make a second attack during each battle phase. Control this face-up card on the field cannot switch. So this is basically a Power Crept High Busanite. So you can also potentially use this for like big OTK pushes, equipping this with like United We Stand, Mage Power, etc., and get in for a ton of damage that way. But it's also a dark, gets under Gravity Bind, so it is good to consider. Next up, we've got Getsu Fuma, which is a very funny sort of anti-fiend, anti-zombie tech card here. Because if this card battles a fiend or zombie monster, destroy that monster at the end of the damage step. So I think this will deal with things like Pyramid Turtle and cut that off. So your opponent won't be able to then get a search off that. It will be able to deal with things like, Ryukoki, which is a card that I'll discuss when I discuss the zombie support that was gotten in this format. So it's a good card to consider if you are going up against one of those decks as a warrior deck, and potentially side this in, although it's unclear how prevalent those cards will be in the metagame, so you might not want to devote the side deck space to this card. Speaking of fiends and zombies, I will be talking about zombies in this section. I won't be talking about fiends as an sort of tribal strategy in this section, because the basically unifying features of that strategy aren't really that relevant in this format. Dark Necrofear is replaced by better chaos monsters. Bark of Dark Ruler can come up, I guess. But in general, there's better traps to play. And also, I guess Puppet Magic of Dark Ruler can be used for like interesting sort of dimension fusion plays, but it really isn't that good. I mean, yeah, the Puppet Magic of Dark Pool is just way, way too situational. So I'm not going to be talking about Fiends as their own sort of tribal strategy here, but it is something to consider. You can build a Fiend strategy if you want to. Next up, we've got Crimson Ninja here. This is a flip monster, level 1, Earth. Flip, target 1 trap card on the field, destroy the target. If the target is set, reveal it and destroy it if it is a trap card. Otherwise, return to its original position. So this is basically an updated version of Armed Ninja, targeting traps. It's searchable off Rhoda, so it's decent to mention here. It also pairs with a very interesting sort of card that released this format called Fuma Shuriken. It's an equip spell that can only be equipped to a ninja monster, of which there are only 3 in the game, I believe, at this point. Crimson Ninja, Strike Ninja, and Armed Ninja. Gain 700 attack. When this card is sent from the field to the graveyard, inflict 700 damage to your opponent. So, you know, I guess you're using this with Strike Ninja, it will fall off when Strike Ninja bandages itself, but then you deal 700 to them. So it's decent in that way, I guess. But if you're just looking for pure attack boost, then there are plenty of better equipped spells here. I mean, Axe of Despair is much better. Like, United Withstand is strictly better. So, yeah, this is mainly just for the Strike Ninja to deal a bit of burn when it falls off. But I don't really think this card is that good. And lastly, for the Warriors, I want to talk about Sasuke Samurai number 3. Now, there are some things you can do with this. You can do things like creature swap, give this to your opponent, and then attack into it with a weaker monster than it, and then draw until you have 7 cards in hand. So that can be a potential decent strategy if you can pull it off. But that's like really tough to do. I mean, like, your opponent has to have, I guess if you have Scapegoat, like, you can switch a Goat token to attack into this thing, take 1,000, draw up to 7. Like, that's fine. But like, if you're using creature swap, you want to use it for a bit more value than that. Like, it's a very convoluted strategy that doesn't really do that much. It draws you cards, but like, you've wasted a turn doing that, and you've also had to play this brick in your deck, and so I don't really think this deck is that good. But it is kind of a funny combo, at least, and so it's something that, you know, if you do want to try and break, you can do it, but I don't really think that it's that good in the long run. Next up, moving on from Warriors, we get the next most competent strategy, in my opinion, which is Beasts. Now, Beast received a number of new, really good monsters here, and the first of them is Berserk Gorilla, which I talked about in the generally good section of the video. 2,000 attack is just a lot of damage here, but they did receive some cards that do go with the typing overall. For instance, Enraged Battle Ox, it's a level 4 Beast Warrior that's 79 attack, 1,000 defense, and it says if your Beast, Beast Warrior, or Wing Beast monster attacks defense monster, inflict piercing battle damage. So that is very, very good. If your opponent is playing a bit more defensively, you can attack over things like Scapegoat tokens with these things, and that can be very, very strong. And, you know, in this strategy, this is where you might want to play the Mad Dog of Darkness, 1900 attack on a beast monster, a dark monster as well to pair with chaos stuff, and that can be very, very good. If you are going for the beast strategy, though, you can also just play Manticore of Darkness natively in the deck. I talked about the combo that got this card semi-limited in the limitless section of the video, but if you're just playing this card as it is, it can be decent. You know, you just send one of your other beasts to bring out a 2300 monster that's really annoying for your opponent to deal with. That can be pretty good. So, you know, I do want to mention it here as potentially a card in the beast strategy. You could also just play a beast strategy and just have the 5 Exodia pieces and card save return in there as well. And that might be the best way to play the Manticore of Darkness strategy here. But very, very cool card. For another beast, we've also got Death Kangaroo. It is a level 4 dark beast monster, 15 attack, 7 defense. It says if the attack of a monster that attacks this monster is lower than the defense of this card, destroy the attacking monster. So that can have some edge cases, but I think it's definitely the worst of the beasts that were introduced here. Although 1500 attack, 700 defense does pair very well with Wild Nature's Release. This is a normal spell. It says target one beast or beast warrior monster, gains attack equal to its current defense until the end phase, and if it does, it is destroyed during the end phase. And of the sort of level 4 beast monsters here, outside of Mad Dog of Darkness, Death Kangaroo will have the next highest attack. So, you know, that is pretty decent to look at in terms of this card, because oftentimes you want to play effect monsters instead of normal monsters like Mad Dog of Darkness. Also, Beast Monster did receive a 2 tribute beast here called Big Koala, level 7, 2700 attack, 2000 defense. It says a species of huge death koala. He's meek, but people are afraid of him because he's very powerful. If you do manage to stick this card in the field, pretty powerful, 2700 attack. And also, you know, with Mild Nature's Release, that gets it up to 4700 attack. So pretty decent to talk about there. But it is very difficult to get this card out. So you likely won't necessarily be playing this card. since all these beast monsters for the most part are earth, or at least the ones that you'd be playing, we've also got Gigantes as another card to put into the strategy, maybe to turn away from like strictly beasts and more into earth aggro. Gigantes is an earth level 4 monster, 90 attack, 30 defense, can't be normal summoned or set, must first be special summoned from your hand by banishing one earth monster from your graveyard. If this card is destroyed by battle, send to the graveyard, destroy all spells and traps on field. So it can turn into a heavy storm if it's destroyed by battle, or it can just act as an extender, getting another monster on board to attack in for 1900. And that can be very, very good in this format. So definitely something to consider if you are playing an Earth Aggro deck. This card is definitely an inclusion. And if we're talking about Earth Aggro, there are also some other Earth monsters that were introduced in this set that also have their own sort of unique typing, and that is dinosaurs. Dinosaurs, they've been around for a while, but they do get some support that can make them a little bit more of a unified strategy. Firstly, they get some big tribute monsters. Black Tyranno is a level 7 dinosaur, 2600 attack, 1800 defense. It says if the only card your opponent controls are in defense position, this card can attack directly. Defense position monsters. I guess if they have spell traps, this card can't attack directly. That is unfortunate. But if they are just trying to play defensive and they just have defensive monsters, you can just get in for 2600. So it basically forces your opponent to summon out monsters in attack position if they don't have any back row. So that can be pretty decent. And if your opponent does have monsters in defense position, Dark Triceratops can also be pretty decent. With a level 6 monster, 2400 attack, 1500 defense. So if this card attacks a defense position monster, inflict piercing battle damage. So that can be pretty good against things like Scapegoat, for instance, that are trying to wall up. This card can be pretty decent. And lastly, we've got Hyper Hammerhead. This is an Earth, level 4 dinosaur, 1500 attack, 1200 defense. At the end of the damage step, if an opponent's monster that battled this card is not destroyed, return that opponent's monster to the hand. This is just a good way to bounce back your opponent's stuff and potentially clear the way for, your bigger beaters. Now, you might be wondering why I'm lumping these all together, as on the surface, they don't really seem to have much in common besides the fact that they're Earth dinosaurs. Well, the reason I'm doing this is because there was a spell released in this set called Ultra Evolution Pill. This is a normal spell that says tribute one reptile monster, special summon one dinosaur monster from your hand. So if you are playing reptile monsters, then you can actually bring out your dinosaurs. And, there are some reptile monsters in this format as well. Balloon Lizard is a new reptile. It's a level 4 monster, 500 attack, 1900 defense. It says put one counter on this card during each of your standby phases. When this card is destroyed, inflict damage to the controller of the card that destroyed equal to the number of counters times 400 points. This is likely going to be in more burn decks, but it is a reptile that can wall up your opponent for a bit. And we also have Gale Lizard. This is a flip monster. It says target one monster opponent controls, return that target to hand. So what you can potentially do with this is flip it up, bounce your opponent's monster back, then Ultra Evolution Pill out a big dinosaur of your own to attack in for a ton of damage. We also got Dawn Turtle. It says when this card normal summon or flip summon, you flip summon any number of Dawn Turtles from your hand. I think this card's pretty bad. I mean, it gets a ton of monsters on field, but you have to have them in hand already. So you're going very low on resources, and generally isn't that good, but it is kind of interesting to consider. And lastly, we got Granadora. This is a level 4 reptile monster, 1900 attack, 600 defense. When this monster normal summon, flip summon, or special summon, increase your life points by 1000 points. When this card is destroyed and sent to the graveyard, you take 2000 points of damage. So, this is potentially another reptile. If you trade it off for Ultra Evolution Pill, you won't take the damage, so that's pretty nice as well. And 1900 attack is nothing to scoff at. Now, of course, there's another reptile that is likely seeing more play than any of these reptiles combined, and that is Sinister Serpent. Sinister Serpent is a staple in this format for good reason, and with Ultra Evolution Pill, you can then get it back later and then, tribute it off again for another dinosaur as well. So Sinister Serpent is definitely a good thing to consider. Although, playing both reptiles and dinosaurs can pair poorly with a card that benefits some tribal strategies, namely Rivalry of Warlords. Continuous Trap says each player can only control one type of monster, send all other face-up monsters they control to the graveyard. So you can play a bit poorly with that. Same with if you're playing Gigantes in a beast deck. But there are some other sort of strategies that can take advantage of that. For instance, if you're playing Gyakuyari Pandas in your beast deck and pairing it with Ojama Trio, then having Ojama Trio on your opponent's side of the field, those tokens are beasts, and with Rivalry of Warlords, that can be very annoying for your opponent to deal with. So, these are good things to consider. You also do have DNA surgery to change all monsters on your side of the field and on your opponent's side of the field to the same type. So that can pair as well with Rivalry of Warlords, and also just sort of resolve your outstanding issue. If you are playing like Gigantes or something, you turn into a beast. That way it'd get piercing off of battle locks, things like that. So there are some things that you can do with these continuous traps. But in my opinion, they're a little bit bricky, so I'm not necessarily sure that I'd go that direction. There's also another reptile beater in the form of Gagagigo. If you don't want the potential downside of Grandora, there's an 1850 reptile that is also level 4, and it is water. Speaking of water, there are some water decks in this format, and you'll notice that a lot of the reptiles here are water, so they can pair with these water decks as well. The main focus of the water deck revolves around Levia Dragon Daedalus. It's a level 7 water monster, 2600 attack, 1500 defense. Says you can send one face-up Umi you control to the graveyard, destroy other cards all on the field. So the idea is if you're playing a Legendary Ocean, which is treated as Umi while on the field, since all water monsters on the field gain 200 attack and defense, reduce the level of all water monsters both players' hands and on the field by 1. So for this, Levia Dragon is a level 6, so it only requires 1 tribute. In addition, you could potentially bring this out with things like Reasoning, as level 7 is not a common call in this format. So, bringing this out and then popping the Legendary Ocean, destroying everything on the field and getting in for a ton of damage can be very good. We've also got Amphibious Bugroth MK3, which also pairs well with a Legendary Ocean. It says as long as Umi remains face up on the field, this card can attack your opponent's life points directly. So 1500 attack will be 1700 if a Legendary Ocean's on field, and you can just get in for 1700 damage every turn, and that can be pretty decent. Speaking of a Legendary Ocean, there are some level 5 monsters that were introduced in this set that you can bring out off of it that are pretty decent as well. We got Giga for the first part. This is a level 5, 2450 attack point monster, water. It is another reptile for Ultra Evolution pill if you want to play it, although if you are playing this, you don't really need the Black Tyranno or the Dark Triceratops, because under a Legendary Ocean, this would be 2650. But, it's just a big beater. And same with Terra King Salmon, another big beater. 2400, so strictly worse than Gigo. But if you do want sort of another beater, then this can be a good card to include as well. Next up, we've got Orca Mega Fortress of Darkness. This is a level 5 water monster. Again, you can bring it out under a Legendary Ocean just by normal summoning it. 2100 attack, 1200 defense. Says by attributing 1 torpedo fish on your side of the field, destroy 1 monster on the field. By attributing 1 cannonball spear shellfish on your side of the field, destroy 1 spell trap on the field. And, we've got torpedo fish, we've got cannonball spear shellfish. These are 2 water monsters with pretty much the same stats. One is level 2, one's level 3, and one is a fish and one is an aqua. Those are the main differences here. But they have the same effect. While Umi is face up on the field, this card is unaffected by any spell cards. So that part doesn't really matter because you're just going to be using this to tribute off for Orca Mega Fortress of Darkness. You can also get those 2 back with salvage. And you'll notice that the Orca Mega Fortress of Darkness is actually on the art of salvage, getting back an Amphibious Bugroth MK3. But you can also get back these Torpedo Fish and Cannonball Spear Shellfish to tribute off again, because this card says target 2 water monsters with 1500 or less attack in your graveyard. Add those targets to your hand, which is very, very good in this format. You can also do, if you want a bit more of a combo heavy thing, you've got the water monster Fenrir, level 4, 1400 attack, 1200 defense. It says this card cannot be normal summoned or set. This card can only be special summoned by removing 2 water monsters in your graveyard from play. When this card destroys an opponent's monster as a result of battle, your opponent skips his or her next draw phase. So the idea here is if you've got a torpedo fish and a cannonball spear shellfish in grave, you can banish them both, summon up Fenrir, fire Dimension Fusion, get back both torpedo fish and cannonball spear shellfish, and then go for Orca Mega Fortress of Darkness to pop some cards on your opponent's side of the field. So that can be a potential strategy that you can use with this. Also, Fenrir, it can pair with Geometrio as well. It is a beast as well. So, kind of interesting synergies across different parts of this tribal strategy here. But, you do want your opponent to have monsters on field that this card can attack over to essentially set up a sort of Yada Lock. And Geometrio can help you do that. Although the Yada Lock effect on this card is not really that good. You could also just play Aqua Spirit as another water monster that can banish cards from your graveyard. But that only banishes 1, so it's not as powerful combined with Dimension Fusion. But it is something good to know about at least. Speaking of water monsters that banish from graveyard, we've also got Lakunga, which does probably what Fenrir does a little bit better, because you can bring it out without banishing, and it says that you can banish 2 water monsters from your graveyard, special summon 1 Lakunga token, plant type, water, level 2, attack 700, defense 700, in attack position. To get an additional body on your field, banishes the 2 monsters, and also 1700 attack, which is nothing to scoff at here. So I think Lakunga is probably the better option over Fenrir. And also it is a plant, which makes it pair very well with Lord Poison. Lord Poison is a water level 4 monster plant. If this card is destroyed by battle instead of the graveyard, target 1 plant monster in your graveyard except Lord Poison, special summon that target. So that means that you can bring out this Lakunga here. You can also bring out other plants like Mystic Tomato, which is a powerful dark recruiter. And, potentially a regional play like a Tomato and Grizzly deck, where you use Mother Grizzly to bring out like Lord Poison, which brings out your tomatoes that you've already used up. There's a bunch of interesting synergies that you could potentially do there. But before I move on to other plant synergies, there's one last water monster here, Gora Turtle of Illusion. It's an Aqua, 1200 attack, 1400 defense, says negate the effect of spell and trap cards controlled by your opponent that target this face-up card on the field. Unfortunately, there's only 1200 attack, 1400 defense, so your opponent doesn't necessarily need to use spell or traps to target. They can just bring out a monster attack over it. So not really that good, but it is another water monster to talk about at least. So I promised some plant mentions with the Lord Poison, and this set did release 2 additional plant cards, and those are Anti-Aircraft Flower and Prickle Fairy, both of which have great synergies with insect decks. Anti-Aircraft Flower is a level 3 plant monster, 0 attack, 1600 defense, says by attributing 1 insect monster on your side of the field, inflict 800 points of damage to your opponent's life points. So this can be good as basically a better cannon soldier. You tribute off your insect monsters and deal a ton of damage to your opponent. Prickle Fairy is a level 4 plant with 300 attack, 2000 defense, says your opponent cannot attack insect monsters if this card battled a monster at the end of the damage step. Change that monster's defense position. So this can be good at protecting your insect monsters on field. And having 2000 defense is pretty decent. And speaking of insects, there was some insect support also released for this set to compare with these plant monsters. The first being Insect Princess, the sort of boss monster of the insect cards, and it's an insect. Level 6, 1900 attack, 1200 defense, says all insect monsters your opponent controls are changed to attack position. If this card destroys an insect monster by battle, this card gains 500 attack. So you compare this with something like DNA Surgery to turn all your opponent's monsters into insects and then, gain attack off this. Also, if you are using DNA Surgery to turn all your opponent's monsters into insects, you can use something like Insect Barrier to sort of, prevent those monsters from attacking. And instead of doing that, you could also use Parasite. This card is a lot more jank, but if you flip this card face up, it gets shuffled into your opponent's deck. If they draw it, then switch them in a defense position, and all their monsters become insects. So can be used in that way to pair with Insect Princess as well. And if this card attacks over enough of your opponent's insect monsters, it can get buffed up fairly decently. Next up, we get Pinch Hopper. If you're wondering about bringing out Insect Princess here, Pinch Hopper can help you do that. When this card you control is sent to your graveyard, you can special summon 1 insect monster from your hand. Now, unfortunately, this card can miss timing, so if you do something like, tribute off an Insect Princess for it, or tribute it off for an Insect Princess, that is, you won't be able to use its effect because the last thing that will have happened is Insect Princess getting summoned to the field. But, this card is good if it's destroyed by battle. You can bring out an insect monster from your hand. So there's some things that you can do there. And it's just good to know about. Next up, we've got Skullmark Ladybug. This is a level 4 insect with 500 attack, 1500 defense. Says when this card is sent to the graveyard, increase your life points by 1,000. So it's sort of an anti-burn tech as well. And, you can pair it with stuff like Anti-Aircraft Flower to damage your opponent while gaining life points too. Next up, we've got Multiplication of Ants. It says tribute 1 insect monster, special summon 2 army ant tokens. These tokens cannot be tributed for a tribute summon. Now, you can use this in conjunction with something like Anti-Aircraft Flower, for instance, to tribute one of your insects, get out 2 insects, and basically turn 800 damage into 1600. Unfortunately, ultimately, you're basically using 2 cards to, set up 2 cards to then tribute off. So I don't really think it's the best in the world, but it is an interesting thing to consider at least. And if you are using things like Creature Swap to give these to your opponent, and then you can attack over them with an Insect Princess, that can be relatively decent, I guess. So this card can potentially see some play here, although I'm not really sure how it would see very good play. Lastly, for the insects, we've got Jade Insect Whistle. This would pair with the Parasite, as I mentioned before. This is a normal split that says your opponent selects 1 insect type monster from their deck. After shuffling the deck, place the card on top of their deck. Now, of course, this runs into a snag if they're playing a different insect monster in addition to Parasite, if they don't have to select Parasite. But if the only insect monster they have is Parasite, then you're feeling pretty good about this. They have to add that to the top of their deck, and then they're going to turn all their monsters into insects. So this is an interesting card. I think it's a bit too jank because Parasite is also a bit too jank. But it is kind of funny to talk about and consider. This is also good in the mirror match, I guess. Or actually, it would be really bad in the mirror match. Then they could just get their best insect from deck to hand. Yeah, so actually this card's only really good if it's not the mirror match. And only really good if you've triggered Parasite. So you can start to see why this card is not very good at all. Moving on from insects, we've got zombies, and zombies are a very powerful sort of tribal strategy that sort of received a lot of support over the past couple sets with things like Pyramid Turtle, Book of Life, etc. And now Pyramid Turtle finally has a decent target to summon out, and that is Ryu Koki. This is a 2400 attack, 2000 defense precision zombie monster. It's level 6, dark. At the end of the damage step, if this card battled a warrior spellcaster monster, destroy that target, or destroy that monster. This doesn't really come up all too often. It can come up against things like BLS. This can deal with that. But like if your opponent brings out the BLS, they'll just banish the Koki. So you kind of have to get aggressive with the Koki to do that. But overall, I think this main reason to play this card is attack stat. 2400, very, very good to bring out off of your turtle, and that can get over things like Great Shooter Spy, Chaos Sorcerer, etc. So I think this card is very good for the zombie strategy. Next up, we got Chopman the Desperate Outlaw. This card is less good for the zombie strategy, but is a zombie, so I figured I'd talk about it here. It says when this card is flip summoned, you can equip one equip spell from in your graveyard to this card. So, you know, if you're playing an equip heavy deck with things like Active Despair, United Withstand, Made Power, etc., and this card can be pretty good in that regard. But otherwise, this card is not the best. Also, it has to be flip summoned, which is very, very difficult to actually do when it has this weak of a defense, and you're in as aggressive a format as Chaos. Moving on from zombies, we've got the machines. The reason why machines are being talked about here is because limited removal is a card at 3 copies in this format, so machine OTK can be alive and well potentially. Let's start with Jalago. Jalago is a level 4 machine monster, 1600 attack, 1100 defense. It's dark. It says if the only cards your opponent controls are face-up monsters with 1600 or more attack, this card can attack your opponent directly. So this can potentially go for a game shot. If your opponent has a bunch of powerful Chaos monsters, bring out Jalago, attack directly, limit removal up, that's 3200 damage. That can be very, very good to do. Next up, we got Boganian. Boganian is a level 3 Dark Machine. It says once per turn during your standby phase, inflict 600 damage to your opponent. So this is more for burn strategies as opposed to the machine OTK. So not really that useful in that deck, but it's a machine, so I figured I'd talk about it here. Moving on from the specific types, we've also got attributable sort of cards as well, starting with Inferno. Inferno is a fire monster like Gigantes, like Aquasphere. It says, cannot be normal summoned or set, must first be special summoned by banishing one fire monster from your graveyard. If this card destroys an opponent's monster by battle and sends it to the graveyard, inflict 1500 damage to your opponent. Now, unfortunately, unlike with Fenrir, which just has you to destroy a monster by battle, Inferno has to send it to the graveyard, so you can't pair it with things like Geometrio. But still, if your opponent does have weak monsters on their side of the field, this can be good at just dealing in a ton of extra burn damage. And 1900 defense is okay, I guess. But ultimately, this card is not the best. I mean, it does pair with another fire monster, Grenmaju de Iza, because it banishes a card from your graveyard. So in a Grenmaju de Iza deck, it might see play just as a way to buff up Iza. But I think overall, it's not really the best. There are also some additional fire monsters introduced in this set that I figured I'd talk about here. You know, I said I'd move away from the type stuff, but there is another type here, Pyro, that does get some support, I guess, kind of, in the Thing in the Crater. The level 4 Pyro monster that says when this card is destroyed and sent from the field to the graveyard, you're supposed to summon one Pyro type monster from your hand. Not a very good effect. I mean, you can summon out Blaziken Pachi, which is a new Pyro from Invasion of Chaos, 1850 attack, 0 defense. So I guess you can bring out that with the Thing in the Crater, but I don't really think that that's worth doing, especially given it's a level 4. I think there's some maybe other pyros like Mr. Volcano, I think is a pyro that came up before. This is a tribute monster, but it's not a very good tribute monster. And in general, this card is just very, very underwhelming for a type that is also very, very underwhelming. That being said, you know, it can see some edge cases. In addition, there are also Molten Zombie and Burning Algae, which are also pyros. Again, they aren't tribute monsters, but they are other pyros that you could play. Molten Zombie says when this card is summoned from the graveyard, draw one card. And Burning Algae says when this card is sent to the graveyard, increase your opponent's life point by 1,000 points. Now, Molten Zombie's effect is actually somewhat decent if you can pull it off. Unfortunately, there aren't as many ways to abuse it because it's a pyro and not a zombie. If it was a zombie, it was the immediate play in zombie decks because you can bring it out off the Book of Life, and that'd be very good. But since it's a pyro, there are a lot less options for it. Basically, the standard like Monster Reborn, Call of the Haunted, Premature Burial, and so it's a bit too situational to see vast play. Burning Algae is just really bad. I mean, there's nothing in this format that really takes advantage of it. I guess you're playing something like Self-Destruct Button, which I'll get to later. Then this could come up. But here it's just really, really bad. Now, speaking of Pyro Monster or Fire Monster in general, there's also Lady Assailant and Flames that you should probably keep in mind. Level 4 Pyro Flip. It says, banish the top 3 cards of your deck, inflict 800 damage to your opponent. And this can pair with Grenmaju de Iza as well. You know, getting Maju up to 1200 at least, and also dealing 800, so that can be pretty decent. But overall, I think this card is not really that good. The blind banish really does hurt. So yeah, I mean, it could also set up for like Dimension Fusion, but again, you don't have choice over what gets banished. So it's a bit of an iffy card in my opinion. Moving on from fire, we've got wind, and that's Sylphid. Sylphid is a level 4 wind monster, 79 attack, 700 defense says this card cannot be normal summoned or set. This card can only be special summoned by removing one wind monster in your graveyard. When this card is destroyed as a result of battle and sent to the graveyard, your opponent discards one random card from their hand. Now, of the sort of banish attributable monsters that I've covered so far, this one probably has the best effect, as discarding a random card from their hand is really good. Unfortunately, there aren't really many good wind monsters out there. Degeneracy exists, I guess. That's pretty much it. I mean, Twin-Headed Behemoth is on the limited list, but again, it's not really that good. And Twin-Headed Behemoth's effect is getting itself out of grave, so I don't really think it's worth it in that regard too. I guess you could play this in like a Harpies deck, but the Harpies deck is like below jank. It's really, really bad. So this card doesn't really have a home right now, but it is good to consider whenever any wind monsters do come up. And lastly, if we're talking about attributes, I should talk about DNA transplant as well. It's basically the counterpart to DNA surgery. It says activate by declaring one monster attribute. All face-up monsters become that attribute. And unfortunately, there aren't really too many ways to take advantage of this. I mean, you could use field spells like Mystic Plasma Zone, Gaia Power, all those sort of attributable field spells to boost up monsters on field, but DNA Transplant will also give that boost to your opponent. So, I'm not really sure why you'd want to do that unless you've cleared away your opponent's monsters getting in for a ton of damage. But there are better cards to deal that damage than DNA Transplant. So I don't really think this card is that good right now. It may have some applications later on in the game's history as attributes become slightly more important. But right now, it's not really that good. Whew, and that will do it for the tribal section of this video. And I think it really shows how many powerful new tools for a lot of jank decks Invasion of Chaos introduced, in addition to the standard sort of chaos stuff. But this wasn't the only stuff that Invasion of Chaos introduced. It also introduced some very powerful strategies that were a bit more degenerate than these. Now, luckily, the degenerate cards that Invasion of Chaos introduced weren't quite as powerful as the Chaos monsters. So it's not like, Burn or Mill or anything becomes like tier 0 in this format. But it did introduce some very powerful cards for those strategies, so I figured I'd talk about them here. Firstly, I want to mention Reload. Reload is a card that's not really specific to any one deck. In fact, this could have potentially gone in the generally good stuff section of the video, because you just basically, it's a quick way to spell. It says add all cards in your hand to your deck and shuffle it, then draw the same number of cards that you add to your deck. So it's basically like a mulligan. You get back cards if you draw like a bad hand, for instance. So it can see some play in a general good stuff deck. However, you have so many powerful cards in this format that in general decks don't really want to do that. This is like a -1, so you don't want to do that. So where this card to be played is in degenerate combo decks. Things like Library FTK, things like Last Turn, things like Scientist FTK, things like Final Countdown, things like Empty Jar. Because those decks are more combo focused. If they draw their bricks, they will want to shuffle them back. So Reload is very good for that. Reload is also a spell for Library too. So I think that Reload is very, very good for those decks and should probably see play in those decks a fair bit of the time. But moving on from just talking about those decks in general, there are also some very specific cards for specific strategies. Let's start with Burn. So Burn received a very powerful monster in the form of Stealth Bird. Stealth Bird is a level 3 winged beast. It says once per turn, you can change this card to face down defense position. When this card is flipped summoned, inflict 1,000 damage to your opponent. This is very good at just dealing them 1,000 damage every turn if you can prevent them from attacking into it. Even if they do attack into this with a monster that's weaker to it, just not to take the damage, they're still taking some damage. So that's pretty decent. You could also play things like Continuous Destruction Punch to sort of disincentivize that. But I don't really think that's worth it. But Stealth Bird is a very, very powerful burn card. 1,000 damage a turn is just super strong. If your opponent can't deal with it, they're going to be taking a lot of damage over a very short period of time. Next up, we got Boganian. I mentioned this in the tribal section of the video, so I'm not going to talk about it too much here, but 600 damage a turn is pretty decent. Balloon Lizard I also mentioned in the tribal section of the video, but the number of counters can add up a fair bit if this card's just left to linger on field. 1900 defense is also not that bad. But moving on to the more specific burn cards here, we've got Curse of Darkness, the continuous trap. So each time a spell is activated, immediately after it resolves, the player that activated it takes 1,000 damage. And that is a lot of damage for spell cards, which are the most powerful cards in this format. So it's a very, very strong card. Also, if your opponent activates Mystical Space Cocoon to get rid of this, I did look into the ruling for this because, the way that this is worded, it makes it seem like you wouldn't take the damage for that, but you do indeed take the damage if you fire MST on this. Now, if you are the one who owns Curse of Darkness and you fire something like Emergency Provisions, then you are perfectly fine. But, if you are just firing an MST at this, then you will take the damage. And 1,000 damage is a lot. So this basically limits your opponent to 7 spell activations max, unless they're able to clear it. And that can be very, very devastating for a lot of decks. Next up, we've got Gryphon's Feather Duster. I included this as a way to potentially clear Curse of Darkness. That also does gain you life points. So it destroys all spell and trap cards on your side of the field. Increase your life points by the number of destroyed cards times 500 points. And, you know, this can potentially come up if, like, you're playing a Princess Burn deck as well. Just using Fire Princess to deal damage every time you gain life points. But I thought I'd mention this here as just a way to clear Curse of Darkness. That can also pair with a sort of sub-archetype of burn. But moving on to some more burn cards, we get Tower of Babel. Tower of Babel is the continuous trap. So each time a spell card is activated, place 1 spell counter on this card. When that spell counter resolves, if the 4th spell counter is placed on this card, destroy this card. And if you do, the player who activated the spell at that time takes 3,000 damage. Now, the unfortunate thing about this is it is easy for your opponent to play around, as, you know, if they see it as 3 counters, they just won't activate any spells. And it can also then shut off your own spells in addition. So this card is a very risky card, but if you manage to get your opponent in a really awkward situation where they've got like less than 3,000 life points, say, and they need to activate a spell to clear what you've got, this card can be very, very good. Although the situations are very hard to come by. Next up, we've got Destruction Ring. Destruction Ring says, destroy 1 face-up monster on your side of the field to inflict 1,000 points of damage to both players' life points. And this is kind of a pair with a Thunder Crash, where Thunder Crash is a normal spell that says, destroy all monsters you control, and if you do, inflict 300 damage to your opponent for each monster destroyed, where both these cards destroy a monster on your side of the field and deal a bit of damage. I don't really think that these are very good, but they are kind of funny, and I guess if you do need to just deal that last bit of damage to your opponent, then these cards can potentially come up. And next up, since I mentioned the Princess Burn sort of side of things, we've got Soul Absorption. Soul Absorption is a continuous spell, so if a card is banished, gain 500 life points for each. I talked about this in the Chaos section of the video, but if you are playing like Fire Princess Burn, then Soul Absorption is a very, very powerful life point gain spell in this format. You can just repeat it constantly, and there are a bunch of Fire Burn spells as well, or Fire Banish spells as well, I mean. So it can pair with that too. This is a Pyro, so you know, the thing with the creator has another target indeed. Next up for the burn decks, we got Blasting the Ruins. Blasting the Ruins is a normal trap that says you can only activate this card if there are 30 or more cards in your graveyard and inflict 3,000 points of damage to your opponent's life points. This sort of pairs with sort of like a self-milling strategy, which there aren't really many ways to do in this format, unfortunately. But, you know, Blasting the Ruins is a very interesting card if you can actually pull it off. It does deal 3,000 damage to your opponent, so that is a fair amount of damage. And if you are playing like a more aggressive burn deck, like a Jar Burn deck, where you're just playing Morphing Jars, Cyber Jars, etc., to sort of go through your deck as quickly as possible, you know, draw into as many of your burn traps as quickly as possible, then Blasting Ruins could potentially be online. Of course, if you're playing a deck that's sending a bunch of cards to the graveyard, I will say that there is also Chaos Necromancer. It's not a burn card per se, but it's a monster that says the attack of this card is the number of monster cards in your graveyard times 300. So, you know, if you are playing a deck turboing through your deck, getting a ton of cards in grave, Chaos Necromancer can be a pretty beefy 1-star monster that you can just normal summon out and attack in with. So, you know, definitely a card to consider here. Now, before I move on to like mill and other things, I just want to mention the other burn cards that are already present in this format that you know you should know about if you want to make the deck. Firstly, Secret Barrel and Just Desserts combined with the Geometrio, very, very powerful in like a Panda Burn sort of deck, a Jar Burn sort of deck, and Gaku Panda, as I mentioned in the tribal section, is still around too. So, you know, these cards make the pretty standard version of the Vampire Burn deck, and I could imagine a Burn deck in Chaos format looking very, very similar. Also, Lava Golem is around as well. Level 8 monster, you can special summon to your opponent's side of the field by tributing 2 of their monsters, and it deals 1,000 points to your opponent during each of their standby phases. So, if you have a way to stop this thing from attacking or dealing damage to you, then it's damaging your opponent for a fair bit every turn. Next up, we got Wave Motion Cannon. Continuous spell that, you know, gains... Well, it doesn't gain counters, but basically it counts the number of turns it's around, and then you get to send it to the graveyard to inflict 1,000 damage to your opponent for each of your standby phases that have passed since this card was activated. Now, the issue with this is that it's very susceptible to Imperial Order. Your opponent can actually chain Imperial Order to the effect to send this card to the graveyard, and it can still actually stop it from going through. So you can just waste a ton of turns and a ton of time setting this thing up for nothing. But it is a very, very powerful burn card and a very, very good one to know about. Now that we're moving on from burn, let's talk about mill. So mill is mainly done through like empty jar sort of strategies now, and those are the best ways, I think, to make a mill deck. But Robin Zombie proposes another way. It's a continuous trap that says if your monster inflicts battle damage to your opponent, send the top card of their deck to the graveyard. So this is a way to deck them out. Maybe if you've got the Yada lock online, you can just summon that Yada, attack in, deal 200, mill them a card, keep doing that. Although that's actively bad for the Yada lock because eventually they'll mill a Sinister Serpent and shut off the Yada lock. But, there are potential decks that you would want to just mill cards from the top of their opponent's deck. In general, this card's really, really bad, though. And mill strategies are now much more aggressive with the sort of empty jar sort of stuff. So I wouldn't recommend playing this, but it is a card if you want a bit more of a slower mill deck. Next up, we got Self-Destruct Button. Self-Destruct Button is a normal trap that is incredibly degenerate. It says you can only activate this card while your life points are lower than your opponent's life points, and the difference is 7,000 points or more. Both players' life points become 0. And this is basically sort of a last resort if you're going for a combo deck and your opponent's about to win the game because you've just taken too much time to pull off your combo, or you've just let yourself get too low. And Self-Destruct Button is a way to reset the game, have a draw, and then move on to the next match. And this is just very degenerate if you win the first game, for instance, because a lot of the time these degenerate strategies will win the first game because your opponent's unprepared for them. And then the second and third game, just Self-Destruct Button twice. You will actually win the whole match, I believe. Because 1 win and 2 draws does, count as a win for the person who won the first game. But yeah, this card is very, very annoying to deal with. And there are many ways that you can actually pull it off. Upstart Goblin, multiple inspection activations. If you're playing a Final Countdown deck, you're likely going to be low anyways. So yeah, I think that this card is very, very rough. And it is at 3 copies here for a lot of degenerate decks, like Last Turn, like Final Countdown, etc. So it is something that you do have to be aware of. Next up, we've got DD Borderline. DD Borderline is a continuous spell that says while there are no spells in your graveyard, neither player can conduct their battle phase. I mentioned this in the Chaos section of this video as well, in addition with the Recycle that you can pair with it. This is another stall card, in addition to things like Messenger of Peace, like Gravity Bind. It's definitely the worst of these stall cards, though. So I wouldn't recommend playing this. I'd recommend just sticking with Messenger of Peace or Gravity Bind, but, it is something to consider potentially. Speaking of cards that slow the game down a bit, we've got Begone Knave. Begone Knave is a continuous trap that says if a monster inflicts battle damage to a player, return that monster to the hand. So this could potentially be good at just slowing down the game a bit. Your opponent has to basically get back whatever monster they summon out to attack into your life points, so they won't quite be able to have a board presence, and it will be potentially a bit better for you. But I don't think this is the best floodgate. It doesn't really stop the issue of you taking damage, so it's not really the best, but it is an interesting card to mention here at least. Next up, we got Spatial Collapse, the continuous trap that basically aims to lock down the board. It says you can only activate this card if both you and your opponent each have 5 or less cards on the field. Maximum number of cards that each player can have on the field is 5. So it's kind of like Kaiser Coliseum in that way, where you're restricting your opponent and yourself a little bit. But it's much worse than Kaiser Coliseum because oftentimes your opponent will be able to get around it a little bit unless they have exactly 5 cards when you activate this. And it's very unlikely that if they have exactly 5 cards on their field that they won't be able to use one and clear up some board space. So I don't really think this card's that good, but it is an interesting card to consider, especially if you're playing things like Geometria that gives your opponent 3 cards already. So 3 cards to go to the 5 total, and it can potentially lock them down that way. Next up, we've got Stumbling and we've got Zero Gravity. These are both cards that switch the battle positions of all face-up monsters in the field in the form of Zero Gravity, and Stumbling switches the battle position when they're actually committed to field. So when you normal summon, flip summon, or special summon a monster, it switches to defense position. And these cards are very good at slowing down the game because it does, prevent your opponent from attacking and with stuff. But also they pair very, very well with the Clown control strategy, Dream Clown and Crass Clown. Both are monsters with powerful effects when they're switched from defense position to attack position in the case of Crass Clown, and attack position to defense position in the case of Dream Clown. Dream Clown pops a monster, Crass Clown bounces it. Either way, you can sort of pair them with Zero Gravity or Stumbling to, sort of use their effects more profitably. If you just normal summon out a Dream Clown, then Stumbling will automatically trigger its effect. In addition, if you have something like Call of the Haunted to bring back Dream Clown in the end phase of your opponent's turn, you can pop whatever monster they commit, then switch Dream Clown to attack next turn, attack in for 1200. And if they don't have any monsters on field, they'll have to basically not attack into the Dream Clown, and then you can switch the Dream Clown to defense on the next turn and pop an additional monster as well. So Dream Clown, Crass Clown, maybe seeing a bit of a renaissance here with these Stumblings and the Zero Gravities. Very, very cool to see these cards sort of supporting a strategy that's a bit fell by the wayside. But, these are sort of the cards that I wanted to mention with pairing with the degenerate strategies. I do think that decks like Burn will probably, be somewhat decent in this form, especially because Chaos Emperor Dragon is sort of a finisher for the Burn deck. But it remains to be seen. There's still a lot of testing to do for these decks. And because a lot of people don't really play these things, there still is a lot of room for optimization and testing here. But, degenerate stuff, tribal stuff, chaos stuff, that wasn't the only strategies that this set introduced into the format. So let's cover those now. Two more strategies that I want to talk about that were supported by Invasion of Chaos are, well, the first of them is Rituals, and Rituals is very, very cool. Firstly, the monster that they got, insanely good card. Manju of the 10,000 hands, light, level 4 monster, fairy, 1400 attack, 1000 defense. Says when this card is normal summoned or flip summoned, you can add one ritual monster or ritual spell from your deck to your hand. Now, if you've been following ritual decks in formats previous to this, basically there were two monsters, Sonic Bird and Senju of the 1,000 hands, one of which got ritual spells from deck to hand, the other of which got ritual monsters from deck to hand. This card is basically combining them, giving you the choice depending on what you already have in hand. And that can be very, very strong. And, Ritual decks might see a bit of a comeback because of it. Relinquished is a very powerful Ritual monster, level 1 Dark monster that can, basically act as removal for your opponent's stuff. And if you're pairing it with the Light Manju, that's already basically a Chaos setup right there. So Relinquish could see a little bit of a renaissance in Chaos format. The additional sort of ritual support that the deck got is Earth Chant. Earth Chant is a ritual spell. It says this card can be used to ritual summon any Earth ritual monster. You must also tribute monsters from your hand or field whose total levels equal exactly the level of ritual monsters you ritual summon. Now, this is very similar to Contract with the Abyss, which came out in Dark Crisis, which worked with Dark Ritual monsters. Unfortunately for Earth Chant, there are only two ritual monsters that are Earth, and that is Performance of Sword and Black Luster Soldier. Black Luster Soldier would be the only one that you really want to go for, because Performance of Sword is really bad. It's level 6 Earth monster with 950 attack. So I don't really think Earth Chant will see much play. If you're just playing Black Luster Soldier, you might as well just play Black Illusion Ritual, or not Black Illusion Ritual, but Black Luster Ritual, because, Earth Chant requires you to have the exact levels. Black Luster Ritual requires you just to have 8 or more stars. So it's a bit more flexible in that regard. So I don't think Earth Chant will really see any play here. But it is interesting to see that sort of the ritual spells are being filled out in that regard. The other interesting deck I want to mention here is normal decks. Normal monster receives some interesting support in this format. Heart of the Underdog is a really big one. Continuous spell, iconic card. During your draw phase, when you draw a normal monster, you can reveal it, draw one more card. So if you're playing a bunch of normal monsters in your deck, Heart of the Underdog lets you turbo into your powerful cards. And it's very, very strong. If you're playing multiple Heart of the Underdog as well, you can draw multiple cards and then keep using the Heart of the Underdog to draw more cards. So this card is very, very strong, can allow you to draw through a lot of your deck, and playing like an Exodia deck especially, that can be very, very good. You can basically draw into your entire deck just on the back of Heart of the Underdogs. So very, very good to see. We've also got Coach Goblin here. Coach Goblin is a level 4 Fiend effect monster that says while this card face up on your side of the field, you return one normal monster in your hand to the bottom of your deck during your end phase to draw one card from your deck. You can only use this effect once per turn. So, this can allow you to sort of, cycle your deck a bit, get rid of cards that aren't quite as useful for you right now. However, the issue with this card is that, it's an effect monster, and if you are playing a normal deck, you probably want to be more maxed out on normal monsters than effect monsters, and you also probably want to have your normal monster in hand. But it is kind of interesting that this card exists for normal strategies. Maybe if you're playing a Manticore deck and you don't necessarily want to draw your Exodia pieces, which can be a bit of a brick, you can use this thing to send back the normal monsters and draw an additional card to get you into your combo. But I think overall this card is not very worth it. Also, two normal monsters were released that completed a set of normal monsters that are very iconic. We got Ojama Black and Ojama Yellow here. Ojama Green had already been released, but now all three are available. And they actually do have a card to pair with them in the form of Ojama Delta Hurricane. Ojama Delta Hurricane is a normal spell that says if you control Ojama Green, Ojama Yellow, and Ojama Black, destroy all cards your opponent controls. So that is a very powerful effect. The unfortunate thing is the condition is extremely hard to pull off. There's no real way to search out all three Ojama pieces here. So, you're going to have a really tough time getting them all on field. Even if you, potentially banish them because they are lights, so they do pair with your Chaos monsters, and then fire Dimension Fusion to get them back with Ojama Delta Hurricane. I feel like the strategy is just a bit too cope, and, you're probably better off just hoping you draw into a Raigeki plus Harpies. That would probably be a lot better for you. But it is kind of interesting that the strategy is released now, and I'm sure some people will try and make it work. The last card I want to mention when talking about normal monsters is Non-Spellcasting Area. This card was not released in Invasion of Chaos, but was released in a previous set. And I think if you are playing an all-in normal monster deck, you could potentially be playing this as a continuous spell. This is all face-up monsters except for effect monsters are unaffected by other spell effects. So this can be good at stopping things, like Raigeki, Darkhold, etc. Just leaving your normal monsters immune and just having big beaters on your side of the field. So it could potentially be good. I don't really think that a normal monster deck that's getting aggressive is the best thing in the world, but it is sort of an interesting idea. So I figured I'd mention it here. But that's going to do it for the other strategies here. I think Invasion of Chaos is really cool for introducing so many pieces of jank support. But it also did release some other cards that, do their own unique things, but I just didn't really find a place to slot them in to the previous section of the guide here. So let's dive into that now. Okay, we got the last couple unique cards of Invasion of Chaos here. Of course, there were some additional normal monsters that I did not cover because they weren't quite unique enough in terms of stat lines or other things like that to actually merit inclusion, because there's a lot of cards in Invasion of Chaos, and getting through them all, this is not a short time frame, but getting through them all, in this time frame is already long enough, and I don't necessarily want to add more to those. So these are the last cards that I'm planning on talking about for this set here before we dive into some example deck lists. And to start off, we've got the last monster remaining, Invader of Chaos. Level 8 Dark Monster, 2900 attack, 2500 defense. It's a fiend. Says that your opponent cannot activate quick play spell cards. So this can be good at stopping things like, Mystical Space Typhoon. It can be good at stopping like Book of Moon potentially. But, realistically, level 8, you want a level 8 monster to do a little bit more like Dark Magician of Chaos does. Invader of Darkness just is not worth it, and it's a bit too hard to bring out. You can't even bring this thing out off of reasoning because your opponent's always going to be calling 8 to stop Dark Magician of Chaos. This card is not really that good. Moving on to the spells, we've got Stray Lambs. This is sort of a version of Scapegoat, which is kind of interesting. Special summon 2 Lamb tokens, Beast, Earth, level 1, attack 0, defense 0. In defense position, you cannot summon other monsters the turn you activate this card, but you can set. So it has a similar condition to Scapegoat. And it summons less goat tokens. It's also not a quick play spell, so you can't use it in your opponent's turn. However, these Lamb tokens can be tributed. So potentially you could tribute set a monster with these tokens, or you could potentially just wait a turn and then tribute summon a monster like Dark Magician of Chaos. Unfortunately, these Lamb tokens don't quite pair the best with Dark Magician of Chaos, because when Dark Magician of Chaos is flip summoned, it doesn't get back a spell. So it's not the best in my opinion. But, if you do have it and you do just want to get it on field for its banishing effect, for instance, then Stray Lambs can be something to consider, but I don't really think it's that good. Next up, we get Yellow Luster Shield. The continuous spell says increase the defense of all monsters in your side of the field by 300 points. I don't really think that this defense boost is that significant. I also don't really think that this card is that good for defensive decks. There are just better stall cards for defensive decks, so you don't really need to be buffing up the defense of your monsters. But it is kind of an interesting card. I did see play in the anime, so that's kind of cool. But overall, not really that worthwhile in the actual game. Next up for the traps, we got a Hero Emerges, and this card is actually really cool. This is another potential way to bring out Democ. This says that when your opponent's monster declares an attack, your opponent chooses 1 random card from your hand. Then if it is a monster that can be special summon it, otherwise send it to the graveyard. So potentially you can use this to bring out Democ, which is actually really cool. And maybe in Democ decks, they will play this because, if you just get rid of all the other cards in your hand besides Democ, then all you've got left is Democ. So it could potentially be good there. But it can also be used just in other decks that do play big tributes and stuff. So this card can come up. It's just, oftentimes you will have a monster in hand that you don't necessarily want to bring out. Also, oftentimes you'll have chaos monsters, which of course can't be special summoned out through this way. And then it will be sent to the graveyard, which is obviously not the best. But if you are playing a Democ deck, then this could potentially see play. But yeah, inclusion here doesn't necessarily mean it's bad. It just means that, I didn't really consider it worthwhile talking about in the other section of the video, but maybe I should have talked about this in the Democ section. Still, very cool card here. Moving on, we've also got Dark Mirror Force. This is basically Mirror Force, but edgy. And also bad. It says, when an opponent's monster declares an attack, banish all defense position monsters your opponent controls. This is very, very hard to actually, pull off. In terms of getting a lot of value off this, because if they're attacking in, you want to get rid of the attacking threat. You don't necessarily want to get rid of their defensive cards. So realistically, this is not going to come up that much, but it is an interesting card here at least. So I figured I'd mention it. I guess you can also activate this card, then chain 0 gravity to it, and then all your opponent's monsters will be in defense. You'll get to banish them. So it's kind of like Mirror Force at home if you combo it that way, but it's just really, really bad. So, you know, it's not really worth talking about beyond that. Next up, we get Energy Drain. This is a trap card that says target one face-up monster you control against 200 attack and defense for each card your opponent currently has in their hand until the end of this turn. So this can come up, you know, it gives your monster an attack boost. Unfortunately, it's like almost always strictly worse than Rush Recklessly. If your opponent has 4 or more cards in hand, sure, it's like slightly better, but Rush Recklessly can be activated at more points in time. And so I don't really think Energy Drain is that good, especially because if your opponent does have few cards in hand, then this card will be really bad. So I don't think Energy Drain is worth discussing really that much, but it is an interesting card here at least. And very, very interesting artwork as well. Lastly, we've got Fiend's Hand Mirror. Fiend's Hand Mirror is sort of the counterpart to Fairy's Hand Mirror. The normal trap that says switch the opponent's spell card effect that targets one spell or trap card to another correct target. And so, you know, this can come up as like, you know, a way to stop like Mystical Space Typhoon, for instance. You can actually turn around and have them pop one of their own cards with Mystical Space Typhoon, which is very cool. But beyond that, there's not really too many applications for this. Maybe because it does stop Mystical Space Typhoon, it can see some play. It can also, like, I mean, that can just be a very devastating effect if used correctly. But I think overall, this card is way, way too specific to actually see much play. So I'm going to say that it probably will not see any play, but it is a cool card to at least know about. And that's going to do it for the new cards that this format introduces. There are a lot of them and a lot of very powerful ones, but that just makes it even more exciting to see what people can actually come up with in this format in terms of decks. So let's show off some deck lists before closing off the video and see, you know, what are some potentially good starting decks if you want to play this format for yourself. Whenever I like to dive into a new format, the first thing that I like to do is look at the last list to win an event and then just try it out for myself, you know. And that's what this list is. This is Ellie Tin Can's Chaos Control list from the last ETC Cup that was held on Format Library in Chaos format. This happened like about 9 months ago at the time of recording. So it's not necessarily the most modern version of the deck, but it is still pretty good. And, you know, playing a deck like this can give you sort of insights into what you'd potentially want to add to the deck yourself if you're adjusting it, and just give you insights in the format as a whole. So let's just quickly go through the card by card here. We got a BLS, we got Breaker, we got CED, we got Triple DD Warrior Lady, Exiled Force, Injection Fairy Lily, Double Kaiku, Magical Scientist, Sangan, and Double Shining Angel here as your light targets for the DD Warrior Ladies and the Shining Angels, System Serpent, Tribe Infecting Virus, Witch of the Black Forest. For these spells, we got Change of Heart Coffee, Dark Hole, Delinquent Duo, Graceful Charity, Harpy's Feather Duster, Mirage of Nightmare, the triple MST to pair with the Mirage of Nightmare, Monster Reborn, Painful Choice, Pot of Greed, Premature Burial is seeing play in this deck. Raigeki, Snatch Steel, and the Forceful Sentry. For the traps, there's Call the Haunted Imperial Order, Mirror Force, Ring of Destruction, and Double Torrential Tribute here. So, you know, pretty, you know, slick lineup here. Playing a lot of very powerful limited cards here. In addition to, you know, 3 of like Warrior Lady, Mystical Space Typhoon. Pretty standard deck from what you'd see in the format. But standard does not mean bad. Standard actually in this case means pretty good. So it's definitely something to experiment with if you are planning on trying out for the format for yourself. This is a very, very good deck. Let's start with. In the side, there are things like Chaos Sorcerer, Fiber Jar, Kaiku, Double Magician Faith, Skill Dark Magician, Yatagarasu, Double Nobleman Crossout, Double Reinforce from the Army, Triple Sacrificial Armor, and a Torrential Tribute. So these are good. Just sort of keep in mind, I will have a link to this deck list in the description of this video. So you will be able to just, you know, play it for yourself right away if you want to. And I will also be making a video sort of playing this deck and testing it out. But I think this deck is a great starting point for the typical sort of chaos decks in this format. And so, you know, I'll be discussing it more in my video on it. But there are also some other decks in the format that you could potentially try. So let's just show some example deck lists of what those might look like. Now, if you want something a bit more of an off-meta pick, we've got Hoy's Chaos Burn deck here. And this actually won a locals tournament in the YGO from Zero Discord server. Link in the description down below if you want to play any games in this format or any other formats that are featured on the channel. But we hold locals tournaments every week. They're smaller tournaments, so, you know, it winning a locals isn't necessarily as impressive as it winning like a full monthly tournament, but it is still very impressive, and it did manage to take down some very powerful players. And I think this does show that, you know, there is potential for decks that are not just the chaos sort of cookie cutter control deck that I just showed you to actually win. And basically this deck is just trying to play a bunch of burn traps like Rain Destruction, Nightmare Wheels, Magic Cylinders, Ceasefire, etc. In addition to some things like, Reflect Bounder, things like that. And just burn your opponent down enough to then use Chaos Emperor Dragon, Envoy at the end as a finisher and deal a ton of burn damage that way. So for the brief card by card, we got Black Little Soldier on in the beginning. We got Breaker the Magical Warrior. We got CED. We got Triple DD War Lady, Fiber Jar, Triple Kaiku, Magical Scientist here, Reflect Bounder, Sangan, Sinister Serpent, Shred Infecting Virus, Witch Black Forest, Change of Heart, Confiscation, Dark Hole, Liquid Duo, Graceful Charity, Heart for the Desert, Maraud Nightmare, Monster Reborn, Triple MST, Painful Choice, Pot of Greed, Raigeki, Snatch Steal, Fourth Century, Call of the Haunted, Ceasefire, Imperial Order, Magic Cylinder, Mirror Force, Nightmare Wheels ×2, and Ring of Destruction here. And then for the side deck, they got Double Hades, Jinzo, Triple Shining Angel, Yatagarasu, Book of Moon ×3, 2 Normal Crosset, and Triple Sakuretsu Armors. And this deck was very impressive in its run, and it shows that Burn has a lot more to experiment with here. And I think Burn is a really cool deck. I mean, a lot of people don't like it, but it is something to play that is not just the standard Chaos stuff. And I think it can be very, very powerful in this format. So this is a great deck list to start off with if you want to try out Burn for yourself. But before I finish the video, I want to feature one other sort of off-meta deck to show that, even if you don't want to, sort of sink into Degeneracy a little bit, there are some other strategies that you can play instead of just pure Chaos. This is Cosmo's Earth Aggro build, which they did bring to the locals as well, although they didn't quite make it all the way, although I think that they didn't have Sangan in the deck when they played it then. But either way, this is a very, very sick. It's an Earth aggro deck, so you're just playing Berserk Gorillas, Goblin Attack Forces, Injection Fairy, Exiled Force, etc. All these powerful Earth monsters, and then you get these Gigantes stacks as extenders to get in even more damage. You'll notice that there are no Chaos monsters in this deck, and this is the first deck that I'm showing off in this guide that doesn't have that. But even though there are no Chaos monsters here, because you're just getting aggressive all the time, you don't necessarily need the Enders, and you can potentially finish the game before your opponent can actually set up for their Chaos plays. It's a very, very cool deck. Let's go through card by card real briefly. We got Triple Berserk Gorilla, Break of the Magical Warrior, Double DD War Lady, Exiled Force, Fiber Jar, Double Gigantes, Triple Goblin Attack Force, 1 Injection Fairy Lily, 1 Magical Scientist, 1 Sangan, 1 Tribe Infecting Virus, 1 Witch of Black Forest. We also got Change of Heart, Confiscation, Delinquent Duo, Graceful Charity, Hard Feather Dutch, Mirage of Nightmare, Monster Reborn, Triple MST, Pot of Greed, Premature Burial, Raigeki, Double Reinforcement of the Army, Snatch Steal, and Force of Sentry. With traps, we got Call of the Haunted, Imperial Order, Mirror Force, and Rain Destruction, and Sakuretsu Armor. For the side deck, we got Dark Triceratops, 2 Pierce. We got Double Wanghu, I assume for recruiter-based strategies, as well as scapegoat things. Dark Hole is an interesting inclusion here, but, it does show that there are so many powerful cards in this format that you kind of do have to occasionally decide which ones to cut or not. Heavy Storm as well on the side. Double Gnome Crossout, Double Poison the Old Man, Double Barrel Behind the Door, Dust Tornado, Double Sakuretsu Armor, and a Torrential Tribute. And then the Fusion deck is the standard thing that you always see. So, this shows that, this deck is very powerful. It did do pretty well in the locals. And it does show that, the meta isn't just Chaos. I mean, Chaos may be the sort of best deck in the room as it's thought of right now, but there are decks that can rise to threaten it, and with more experimentation, maybe there will even be decks that will surpass it. I mean, it's unclear at this point. I think that Chaos will still be at tier 1 no matter what happens, so if you enjoy playing Chaos decks, you should be happy in this format no matter what. But I do think that there is a lot of room for experimentation, and maybe this format won't be as quite a tier 0 format as it was thought of in the past. But I hope that you enjoyed this long guide to this format, and I hope that you do check it out for yourself. I'm going to be releasing a lot of Chaos content coming up, and it should be a lot of fun. Again, if you want to play games in this format, then check out the YGO from Zero Discord server in the link down below. If you enjoy this sort of content and want to see more Chaos videos, definitely subscribe to the channel. And also, if you want to support me directly, I do have a Patreon, link in the description as well, which has fun perks, such as exclusive videos, being able to suggest video ideas, and also getting your name shouted out in these videos. So speaking of that, shout outs to Rinswin and Brendonker for my patrons, and I couldn't do it without y'all. But with all that out of the way, I hope that you enjoyed this guide as always, and I look forward to playing Chaos with y'all. Until next time, I've been Ben from YGO from Zero, and I'm signing off.